So what I'm going to be doing is just kind of hanging out. I'll take some questions, not a whole lot, but really just putting forth my my active research, because I'm in the process of finishing up the book. The book will be done really soon. There's only 2 chapters to go. Okay, I have a chapter on Kerry Thornley, and I have a chapter on Jack Valente, and then some miscellaneous cleanup and epilogue. That's about it. Not a whole lot. So, but I wanted to start kind of broadcasting the research that I'm doing. Now, this today we're going to go over the Kerry Thornley files that appear within the Garrison papers. Some really fascinating stuff. One thing you learned about Garrison is the way he formulated his files. Here's a perfect example. The very first page, so you have the folder and you open it up, and the very first page in the Kerry Thornley file says Office J.D. Tippett, Volume 7 of Texas Report. Okay, why would Garrison have put a piece of paper like this in the Kerry Thornley file? Well, obviously Kerry Thornley was involved in the shooting of J.D. Tippett, right? So, but we're probably not going to talk about that today. Today, I really just need to go over this research to iron out what's going to go into my Kerry Thornley chapter coming up. So, we're going to be here for a while. Just kick back, and hopefully you get something out of what I'm doing here today. Okay, so all right, so the Kerry Thornley file starts off with the Douglas Jones stuff, which is fantastic. Douglas Jones Printing, 422 Girard, advised after viewing the photograph of Lee Oswald that although he could not positively be sure, he said that he did not believe the person ordering the printing of the handbills relating to Cuba last May 29th was Oswald. He said that to the best of his recollection, the man ordering the handbills was a husky-type person on the order of a laborer. He said that he remembered the person ordering the handbills did not have a Cuban accent and did not look like a Cuban to him, and he therefore wondered why this person would be involved with the Cubans. He again stated that he could not positively say the person ordering the handbills was not Oswald, but he did not think it was. Jones said he could not furnish any other identifying data concerning this person ordering the handbills. So the Douglas Jones incident at Jones Printing, that relates to the flyers, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee flyers that Oswald was seen handing out on the street. Oswald didn't have those printed. Those were printed by Kerry Thornley, and that was one of the biggest indicators that Kerry Thornley was a major player in on this setup. Okay, this is where it starts to get funny, because Kerry Thornley is like the most full of shit person that's ever been. I said once before that if they ever made a Mount Rushmore of stupid, it would have one face on it, and that would be the face of Kerry Thornley. When we get through this file today, and I think it'll take us a couple hours to get through, you'll see what I'm talking about. My name is Kerry Wendell Thornley. I presently reside in Atlanta, Georgia. My mailing address is Box 827, Atlanta 30301. I'm employed as a part-time student assistant at Georgia State University. That's interesting. I'll have to look into that. In the spring of 1959, while stationed in Marine Air Control Squadron 9 at an outpost of El Toro Marine Base, Santa Ana, California, I became acquainted with another young Marine in the same outfit named Lee Harvey Oswald. My Warrant Commission testimony relating to this period can be found in Volume 11 of the 26 volumes, which supplement the Warren Report. In October 1959, while serving in Marine Air Control Squadron 1 at Sugi Naval Air Station at Sugi, Japan, I read in the newspaper that my former acquaintance, Lee Oswald, had walked into an American embassy in Moscow, turned in his passport, and announced his intention of taking up residence in the Soviet Union. I thereupon decided to write a novel about a young Marine who becomes disillusioned with the United States as a result of his overseas tour of duty in the Marine Corps, and in the end defects to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The title I chose for this first novel attempt was The Idle Warriors. Let me screenshot that. Oh, I'm going to be fucking overloaded with screenshots today. I just know it. during the brief period of time that I had known Oswald, he seemed genuinely disillusioned with the United States and claimed to believe that the Russians had a better system. He had just been overseas in the Marine Air Control Squadron 1. Now that I was overseas and serving in the same outfit in which he had served previous to meeting me, I was also becoming disillusioned with the United States and coming more and more to the feel that I could understand his apparent defection to the Soviet Union. As Oswald had been, I became an outspoken critic of U.S. foreign policy and of the Marine Corps in particular. As Oswald had done, I began to disobey orders and ridicule my military supervisors. And, as had Oswald, I began espousing Marxist doctrines. Moreover, I boasted that I was writing a poor man's ugly American, which would blow the lid off the situation resulting from peacetime stationing of troops in the Far East. This is all so contrived. Kerry Thornley was obviously working with intelligence from the minute he got into the Marines. He obviously has some sort of familial connection, because that's always how this goes. But yeah, this statement is complete bullshit. Looking back, I feel that both Oswald and I must have been put under surveillance by the Office of Naval Intelligence during our periods of active duty in the Marine Corps. The Cold War was raging. The Cold War was raging then. He was widely regarded a communist a year or so before the U-2 incident. I began to acquire a similar reputation with the brass in Marine Corps S1 from about the time of the U-2 incident, May 60, I believe, until my discharge in October of 1960. It seems odd to me that the Office of Naval Intelligence could find no reference to Oswald in its files in 1963, nor any to me in 1975 when I recently made a Freedom of Information inquiry. I think it possible that someone in the Naval Intelligence bureaucracy may have seen to it such files, if they ever existed, were misplaced or stolen or completely destroyed. That's interesting. I continued work on the Idle Warriors after I got out of the Marine Corps. I also continued a close relationship with one other Marine from MACS 9 and MACS 1. This man struck up a friendship with me at the time I knew Oswald. He and I were then assigned overseas duty together at in MACS 1, where our friendship continued in Marine Air Control Squadron 1 at Atsugi. This individual had the highest job security of any enlisted man in the outfit. If I had some kind of intelligence babysitter when I was in the service, it was almost certainly this man. His name is Bud Simcoe. All right, so that's a name to remember. Bud Simcoe sounds fake, but we'll see what we can't find on that. Let me just take the whole paragraph. His name is Bud Simcoe, and his immediate supervisor was Lieutenant Ballantyne. Together, they maintained the top-secret security and classified files, S&C files, for the squadron. I wish to stress that I do not at all believe Mr. Simcoe was involved in any illegal activities or any activities relating directly to the John Kennedy assassination. Approached by a legally constituted authority, I think Mr. Simcoe would say truthfully whether or not he was ever assigned to submit reports on me. We spent most of our free time together. The latest phone number I have for Bud is apparently misplaced, but I obtained it by calling his old place of work, Vorpal Galleries in San Francisco. See, now, if I was just looking really to dig into minutia for this particular statement made by Kerry Thornley, I would be pulling all these fucking names and researching all of them. Vorpal Galleries. I'd be pulling where is that? Ballantyne. I'd pull all these names and make a list, but that's not the purpose of this today. I'm just looking for information regarding who Kerry Thornley was and evidence showing that he was duplicating Oswald in a bunch of places. That's basically what the chapter is about. And it ended up half the book is about that when I didn't really intend it to be that. Let's see. From the time of my discharge at the end of October 1960 until February of 61, I lived on my discharge money in Southern California. Bullshit. You were in New Orleans at the time, you fucking liar. Bud got back from Japan a month after I did and went to work as an insurance investigator. I'm sure he did. Insurance investigator. That is supposed to be the profession of Vincent Calderon Jr., the real Raoul. Insurance investigator, but we all know that wasn't his real profession. See, another friend and I decided in early 61 to go to New Orleans together and take up residence there. And you were there before 61, for sure. This was Greg Hill, who presently resides at 55 East Houston, apartment 4-E, New York, New York, and whose phone is 212-226, blah, blah, blah. Let me screenshot this here because Greg Hill is a name I'm not overly familiar with, and I'm going to have to look that shit up because that's somewhat important. Greg and I arrived in New Orleans on the day after Mardi Gras of 1961. We had a difficult time finding work. Our living conditions were sparse and harsh. I continued work on The Idle Warriors, writing the chapters in short story form and sending them off to publications like Playboy in hopes of selling one of them for $2,000. Meanwhile, living off French bread from the day-old bakery. What are the notes here? It says, Thornley speaks fluent Spanish. Oh, that's good to know. Thornley speaks fluent Spanish. That becomes important later on because... I'm going to screenshot this motherfucker. Here we go. So Thornley speaking fluent Spanish is super important because when Thornley is staying at the boarding house at 621 North Marsalis, when he's staying at 621 North Marsalis, allegedly with Mary Bledsoe, who was the bus witness later on for Oswald, which we're not going to talk about today, allegedly he gets phone calls from a woman who speaks in Spanish. Mary Bledsoe fucked up on the stand when she was being interviewed for the Warren Commission deposition, and she said the woman speaks Spanish. And then there was a whole who's on first incident back and forth. But ultimately, Thornley speaking fluent Spanish supports the notion that he was living at the 621 North Marsalis and not Oswald, because Oswald didn't fucking live at any of the places that we believe that he did at all. So, let me continue to move on. By this time, my politics had gone through another change. I had become a Marxist upon seeing my first Starving People when MACS-1 was on maneuvers to the Philippines. As I was phasing out of the corps, I read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged and decided the world's hungry people could do best under unlimited free enterprise instead of socialism. Duh. This is all bullshit, right? He's writing out a statement of fake life, because this guy was obviously, he was in the Marines, he was working with the CIA, he was probably ultimately naval intelligence also, and then he went on, obviously, with the Discordian Society and shit. That was all CIA propaganda later. So the guy was intelligence the whole time. So he's coming up with all these, I was this, I was that, I was a communist, then I read Ayn Rand, and I wasn't a communist. Bullshit. Like, this is all fake. My political evolution from I like conservatism to liberalism to Marxism to Ayn Rand to individualist anarchism to communist anarchism has been one of the major sources of misunderstanding about my case all along. I include the information on my political shifts. I like to think of them as advances because it is essential to an understanding of my motives at various points. So by the time Greg and I went to New Orleans, I'm going to have to look into this Greg person because he doesn't pop up anywhere in fucking anything in this investigation at all. And we can say with certainty that at some point in time, probably between May and August of 63, Kerry Thornley was living with David Ferry. So that I'm going to have to figure out the timeline surrounding that. So by the time Greg and I went to New Orleans, I was in many respects a right-winger. Among other things, I bitterly opposed John F. Kennedy, and I believed that he was going to ruin the country. February and March in New Orleans were difficult times for Greg and me. I believe that it was in late March or early April that I finally managed to get a part-time job as a telephone solicitor at the Foster Awning Company. All right, so let me screenshot that. So all these little dribs and drabs that he gives us are pieces of a different puzzle, but we're gonna collect them anyway. Piecing together chronologies, timelines, getting people to contradict themselves in statements. This is all part of the investigative process. And Kerry Thornley is, I fucking swear to God, he is like he's a total moron. Like the guy it obviously had anti-interrogation training and all that stuff, but his execution of it was just fucking poor. February and March in New Orleans were difficult times for Greg and I believe it was in late March or early April that I finally managed to get a part-time job as a telephone solicitor. The fact that I had a full beard had prevented me, I think, from getting a job sooner. So we had a full beard. When was this? This was in 1961. Okay, so okay, the fact that he had a full beard. This is important because it goes into whether or not he was the person staying with David Ferry in September. He was staying in September of '63. He was seen by Perry Russo at David Ferry's party, right? So, it gets a little complicated with the timeline surrounding this, but Perry Russo described him as having whiskers, meaning like not clean shaven. But he had met that person in the months leading up to that incident where he had a full beard. Obviously, the only person who had a fucking full beard this entire time in the Kennedy assassination story is Kerry Thornley. So, I mean, it's obviously him, but I like to get these little pieces of the puzzle just to kind of support that. I guess I'm doing an interview tonight. I don't know where, but I'll have a link at some point. But I guess I'm doing a show at 6:30 Mountain Time. It was probably somewhere in the early part of April that I met Slim. This is where shit gets good, because this is where his story goes off the fucking deep end. So it was probably somewhere in the early part of April that I met Slim Roderick R. Brooks. Okay, like this fucking story. Holy shit. When I read this, like having known the real backstory, when I got to this part, I just was fucking laughing my ass off. I got to do a dab for this motherfucker. So, where are we? It was probably somewhere in early April that I met Slim Roderick Brooks one day at work. Somehow, he was sitting at a phone desk, which I was to take over for a short while before both of us got off work. I'm not sure of the exact details. Of course you're not. It's only your life, but you don't know the exact details. But whatever these were, I wound up sitting at Slim's desk, and I noticed immediately that he had left some kind of dawdling behind him, Japanese kanji symbols, which I had studied in MACS 1 overseas. You see the over-explanations, right? He gives too much detail is the fucking problem. Anybody who gives too much detail is a fucking liar. I went up sitting at Slim's desk, and I noticed immediately that he had left some dawdling behind him. It turned out he turned to Slim and said, "Hey, I'm just back from Japan, and I'm writing a novel on peacetime Marines in the Far East." Slim nodded. Slim nodded his head, almost as if in agreement with my statement, smiled at me, and proposed that we spend the afternoon together. This sounds like some gay shit going on here, if you ask me. When we went by the day-old bakery and then to Slim's small French Quarter apartment, there Slim introduced me to Margaret, a waitress in maybe her 40s, who was somewhat of an alcoholic, I think. See, he's coming up with additional detail that are not relevant to the story to fluff the fucking thing, right? This goes back to like the OSS doctrine of rumors, right? By providing explicit, concrete detail, right? Explicit detail of shit that never fucking happened and gives the story more credibility, and this is what he's doing. We went by the old Dale Bakery and then to Slim's small French Quarter apartment. There, Slim introduced me to Margaret, a waitress in maybe her 40s, who was somewhat of an alcoholic, I think. She and Slim were old friends on a non-sexual basis, and I believe that at this time they were temporarily living together. If this woman is still alive and can be found during the course of an investigation of Slim, I am sure she can provide a wealth of valuable information. In 1963, she was working in Fong's Chinese restaurant on Decatur Street. Here we go. See, explicit, concrete detail, right? That's what he's doing. Slim was a fascinating, colorful figure. Presently, he was suffering with a bad case of TB. But previously, he had worked as a seaman, a lumberman, a U.S. Marshal in Alaska, etc., etc. We sat around his place drinking cold coffee out of mason jars while he talked about his adventures, and I talked about Ayn Rand's objectivism. Remember, this is a statement from Kerry Thornley, okay? When innocent people write statements, they write, "I don't know shit, thank you," and they sign it. All right, this motherfucker is giving like a multiple-page statement about what? His life. because he's drowning them with fucking bullshit details to obscure the fact that he was fucking involved in the assassination. He expressed his dislike for Jews, Poles, Gypsies, homosexuals, Russians, Mexicans, and so on with a chuckle, usually, which left me with room to assume he wasn't really very serious about it. And that, of course, was the assumption I preferred to make, since I really liked Slim a lot, and Gary was his friend. This is where it gets interesting. Gary and Slim, right? So remember these two names. I think I first met Gary at Slim's one afternoon. Very quickly, the conversation got around to politics, and we discovered that we had both hated Kennedy, or something to that effect. Slim interjected, "I did it. I was a catalyst." I would not remember the incident at all, but for Slim's comment. Had that been our only meeting, I would quickly have forgotten Gary entirely. By this time, I had another close friend in the quarter. Her name was Ola Holcomb. All right, let me snap that shit. That's important. I'll have to look that up. I mean, in the end, it's probably not important. And the fact that it's not important is important because he's presenting it as important, right? So I think Slim met Ola through me, and Gary met her through Slim. By sometime in May, it looked as if Gary and Ola were going to hit it off together, or so I reconstruct events, because Slim and Gary and Ola all dropped by to visit us on Memorial Day weekend, probably Sunday afternoon. I believe Ola was present on this occasion, but am not absolutely certain. In any case, very soon after, if not by then, she and Gary had a thing going. I do remember a couple of things very clearly about this visit. I recall Gary sitting there. Well, I lost my place. Where the fuck was I? I'll pick it up here. I think Slim met Ola through me and Gary, blah, blah, blah. I believe Ola was present on this occasion, but not absolutely certain. In any case, very soon after, if not by then, she and Gary had a thing going. I do remember a couple of things very clearly about this visit. I recall Gary sitting there, sort of leaning back on a chair with his hands behind his head, smiling and looking at the typewriter sitting on the desk in the living room of the apartment. Here we go again with the over-the-top details. I also recall Gary making some kind of remark about being or knowing a fence for stolen goods. I think he mentioned a pawn shop on Canal Street by name where the guy was willing to purchase things that were stolen. I'm drowning here in Kerry Thornley's over-the-top explanation of simple things. His obedience to providing such explicit fucking detail is just, it's unbelievably over the top. On Memorial Day, the typewriter, an Olympia, here we go with details, right? Fine details. An Olympia, probably a Swiss brand, right? This all goes right back to the doctrine of rumors. Was stolen while Greg and I were out. It was our habit to leave the door unlocked. We knew almost no one in the city at this time. Our apartment was on the second or third floor. It seemed at the time to both Greg it was a very logical possibility that Gary Kirsten had taken the typewriter. Why are we talking about a fucking typewriter, right? You see what he's doing here? In retrospect, I believe strongly that this is exactly what happened. I believe that Gary mentioned the fence on Canal Street for two reasons. One, I think he knew the guy, and if I had gone in there looking for it, Gary would then know I suspected him. Two, I think Gary wanted me to conclude that if he did steal the typewriter, his motives were economic rather than political. Like, this story means nothing to nothing, right? So he's providing a statement to Garrison here, and he's just going off on tangents that mean nothing. And then at the end of the day, he'll provide him like a 5-page statement and say, what are you talking about? I'm cooperative. I provided you a 5-page statement. It is important to realize that I had already typed some of the short story versions of the Idle Warriors chapters on this typewriter. These manuscripts I was to give away later, possibly to Slim, after I reworked them into a novel manuscript. In other words, it is probable that Gary Kirstein had in his possession for an indefinite period one of the typewriters on which portions of the Idle Warriors, which he probably also got a hold of, were typed. I have some Xeroxes of the letters I wrote during this period of time, which I talked about Slim. I also have many other memories, which I will be glad to provide when and if that becomes necessary, including the names of one or two other witnesses who knew Slim then. Instead of plunging into detail now, let me simply say that Slim took me under his wing and made me feel at home in New Orleans. Around the middle of April, Greg and I moved into an apartment in the French Quarter on St. Louis. On April 17th, which was my 23rd birthday, And also, I realized recently in the day of the Bay of Pigs invasion, Slim, who was also once a ship's barber, gave me a haircut. And Garrison has marked New Orleans, April 61. Speaking of the Bay of Pigs invasion, there is one detail about Slim which I had better mention here because I am almost sure now that it is significant. Slim claimed that his hobby was navigation, and he had a great number of federal navigational charts rolled and stacked in a pile in his apartment. Most of these, as I recall, or of those that I saw, were of the Caribbean area. Slim never voiced strong political opinions, but I believe, in retrospect, that he was working with the anti-Castro groups, then functioning in Louisiana. I think he was probably a navigational advisor of the Bay of Pigs invasion. This is hilarious, right? Because Kerry Thornley was actually the person who was working with Guy Bannister at 544 Camp Street, not Oswald. So he was knee-deep in the fucking Cuban invasion stuff as it was. For him to try to put it off like he had nothing to do with it, to me, is hilarious here. It says, I also think our meeting at the Foster Awning Company may not have been a chance meeting, but that Slim may have been assigned to intercept me and babysit me because I was writing a book on Lee Harvey Oswald, who, for one of many possible reasons, may have been of great interest to elements within the intelligence community at that time. What does that say? It says, the notes, the Intel / communities standard... Can't read what that says. For staff. Standard, maybe jargon for staff. Standard jargon for staff is what I think it says. I can't really be sure of that. It was shortly after Greg and I moved out of the quarter from the slums of the Irish Channel that Slim introduced me to Gary Kirstein, who he said was his brother-in-law. Just in from Kansas City. Slim warned me in advance that Gary was something of a weasel, a sly, a shady character who had lived on the fringes of this criminal world. All right, let me see if I can find this here. All right, so this I found fucking fascinating because, obviously, if you're not familiar with my work, the shooter on the grassy knoll was Jack Valenti, right? Jack Valenti was born in September of 1921. Then I get to all this Kerry Thornley stuff, right? And Kerry Thornley starts talking about this guy, brother-in-law, right? So he says, it was shortly after Greg and I moved to the quarter from the slums of the Irish Channel that Slim introduced me to Gary Kirsten, who he said was his brother-in-law, right? So here's just a passing reference. But as you go through this file, he actually referred to him as, quote, brother-in-law, right? So brother-in-law becomes Kerry Thornley's contact, right? Who he thinks that he set him up. But anyway, as you go through this, you'll see, and we'll get to it, I'm sure, throughout the day, that this person went by the name brother-in-law. It wasn't just his brother-in-law. Kerry Thornley explains that they ended up calling this guy brother-in-law as a nickname, right? And I had already done my work on Jack Valenti, and I already determined Jack Valenti was a shooter on the grassy knoll, right? And so then, as I'm researching Jack Valenti, I find that there's another Jack Valenti, born in 1936, whose gravestone just says brother-in-law, right? I don't know what to make of this. I don't know what to make of this at all. I looked into this Jack Valenti, and he doesn't appear to have been a brother-in-law at all. It doesn't appear that he had ever been married, which means that one of his sister's husbands gave him the name brother-in-law. See, this is one of those things that I have to get to, like, in the years to come. But Kerry Thornley repeatedly going on about brother-in-law, and then there being a Jack Valenti whose nickname was brother-in-law. I'm sorry, there's something fucking weird going on here. I don't know what it is, and hopefully one day I will sort it out. My suspicion is that this Jack Valenti was somehow involved with the assassination, because remember, these guys, they use people with duplicate names and all that stuff. So I don't really want to get into that today. But yeah, Kerry Thornley's talk of brother-in-law freaked me out when it came to this. So back to it. I have some. Let me see. Did I already read this part? Pigs. Yes, I already got through that. Gary didn't look like a criminal at all. He dressed very straight. He wore neatly pressed slacks and short-sleeved shirts. If anything, he dressed like an off-duty policeman. He was an older man, perhaps in his 40s, certainly at least in his 30s. He had brown hair and was balding. Brown hair and was balding, was medium build in height, smoked a pipe, and spoke in what was at times almost a whine, except his words were clipped and precise. His accent was Midwestern. That description sounds like Vincent Calderon Jr., who's the real Raoul, but we're not going to get into that too much. One of the first things I learned about Gary was that he also hated Kennedy, but for somewhat different political reasons than mine. Gary said that he was raised in a Germanic Midwestern family and that he was a Nazi. He and Slim used to joke about this and also about Gary's alleged skills at burglary. Gary was keenly intelligent and had a flippant, lighthearted air about him. Therefore, even though the content of his humor was often sadistic, Gary did not seem for real. He never sounded angry, for example, but he cheerfully recounted little jokes the Nazis had played on the Jews and other victims of their prejudice. It was also typical of Gary's grim sense of humor about his own pro-war philosophy to steal something that was to be used to advance his political ideas on Memorial Day. For example, one of the other memories I have of Gary concerns his attitude towards the anti-war song which Joan Baez, I think, popularized at the time, called Where Have All the Flowers Gone? They had been picked by young maidens to decorate the graves of young soldiers who had been killed in the wars, and the song contains the oft-repeated refrain, "When will they ever learn?" Gary's comment, "I like that song, ha ha." One day, Slim and Gary and I went to the drugstore at the corner of Canal Street and Camp Street. We went in and sat at the counter in order to eat or have a coffee. Gary excused himself, saying with a smile that he had an errand to run, that he would rejoin us shortly. At the time, I was not aware that the offices of Guy Bannister, later named by Jim Garrison as a suspect in the JFK assassination, and now known widely to have been a friend of Howard Hunt, and a coordinator of anti-Castro and other intelligence activities in that area, were immediately adjacent to the drugstore. So, mega important. Mega important. While Gary was gone, Where Have All the Flowers Gone was either played on the jukebox or Slim simply pointed to it on the selector there in front of us and said, brother-in-law likes that song. You see, brother-in-law likes the song. So here he's being referred to specifically as brother-in-law. Only he has a different way of thinking about it than most people do. I replied, yeah, I know. I do not remember how I knew. But Gary had mentioned it earlier in some connection or other, possibly as it was playing on his car radio. It was probably in June or July of '61 that I met Jessica Luck, a 19-year-old philosophy major at Tulane University. Jessica and I were to have a romantic, passionate, and stormy relationship for the next year or two. Look at the alliteration, right? It was romantic, passionate, and stormy, right? So he's obviously a smart guy. He knows how to write. He's obviously been trained in counterintelligence and anti-interrogation and all that stuff. Doing a good job of it to some degree, except he's a little over the top, and that is what would give him away to any trained investigator looking for a spy. At some point, Jessica and Slim and Gary and I drove out to Jefferson Parish and looked at some land which Gary had purchased along Jefferson Highway. Meanwhile, Gary was living with that's another thing. Like, if you wanted to do some deep research on this, you could go and pull Gary Kirsten. Allegedly, he bought some land in 1960, between 60 and 62, let's say, 60 in July of 61. And then you could pull the records to see if that even happened at all, which probably didn't. Meanwhile, Gary was living with Ola in a ground floor apartment in the French Quarter. According to what Greg and I had been told, he was working for Anheuser-Busch. He was also painting in his spare time. He had frequently mentioned that Hitler had been a painter, and he had been unfairly criticized because his paintings were too realistic. I simply have no tag in my memories of Gary to indicate to me when it was that he was working for Papa Joe Conforto. Papa Joe Conforto. So I attempted to connect Papa Joe Conforto to Janet Conforto, Jada, and I could not do it. So there might be a connection there. You never know. A Bourbon Street nightclub owner with many sons who had helped out in the business. It could have been before he went to work at Bush. It could have been moonlighting while he was at Bush, or, as seems most logical, it could have been after he quit at Bush, but for a time he did work for Papa Joe, doing what I do not recall if I ever knew. I hope any scholar of this statement... What? Hold on a second. This is fucked. I hope any scholar of this statement will take the thought to realize that these events took place as far back as 14 years ago, and will also take the trouble to verify that I have had an excellent long-term memory, especially for ideas being discussed. Things which struck me as important at the time I recall clearly. Things which struck me as important a few years later I recall less quickly, but in many instances quite vividly, though in others not. Right? Do you see what he's doing here with the alliteration? Generally, things which have only struck me as important recently have been the most difficult to dig up. I am not unaware of the impact of my words. Where the fuck was I? I am not unaware of the impact my words may have. I do not seek to distort reality, but to discover it for the sake of my own sanity, as well as for the political well-being of the rest of humanity. I wish to cause harm to no one, not through what I say, nor through what I fail to say, knowing it to be true. Like, literally, fuck this guy. Reminds me of Ari Fleischer. Sometime in 1961, Gary's house on the land showed us it was built, and he moved from the French Quarter to Jefferson Parish. In earlier writings, I stated Gary lived in Kenner. That is an error. A letter I wrote on New Year's Day of 1962 indicates that Gary's land and house were in Jefferson Parish. See, that's interesting because member David Ferry allegedly made a stop in Kenner on the way to Houston. So who knows if there's any relevance there. In the middle of the summer of 61, I went to work full-time at the American Photocopy Equipment Company in Kenner. Let me screen grab that. Not too long after that, Gary returned to California, and I moved into a housekeeping apartment on Napoleon Avenue just around the corner from Jessica's family home. She lived with her parents. It was about this time that the only interaction with Gary occurred, to which I am still unable to attribute retroactively any significance. I attempted to obtain some abortion-causing pills through Gary. Slim and Gary took me from one place to another for hours. I did not vividly recall where all we went. It was for a coffee here, on an errand in the car to a house out by the lake there, and finally we drove to a remote spot under a tree out in the country. I still do not know why. All this time, although Slim had informed Gary in advance what I wanted, Gary said there was nothing about pills. Once we reached our isolated rural destination, the three of us got out of the car and hunched down under the big tree. Gary then graphically explained how such pills work by poisoning the woman's body so as to cause it to reject the fetus, and told me the location of a drugstore where a dishonest druggist would sell them to me without a prescription. I silently decided against obtaining the pills because they sounded so dangerous. Like, what the fuck does any of this have to do with the Kennedy assassination? Nothing. This is an elaborate tale to cover up a bunch of bullshit. Finally, I had finished most of the Idle Warriors. First of the two drafts I gave to the Warren Commission and hired a young lady by the name of Joyce Talley to type it. Now, if Joyce Talley was CIA, that would explain a lot. Let me screenshot this. That's pretty interesting. Now, if Joyce Talley was CIA, that would explain a lot, but I doubt if she was. Otherwise, she really was a student at LSUNO in Martin McCullough's English class. See, what he's doing is he's drowning people in too much irrelevant information. It'll take, like Garrison at the time, if he were to follow up on all the leads in this statement, it would take him fucking forever. Forever. All right, let's see if we can't figure out what this says up top here. There's a cutoff up there. Now, there we go. So, where BR saw something Lee Oswald. where BK saw. Oh, okay. This is where somebody witnessed the. This is where it fucking gets good for me, because this will illustrate how many people who say that they had an interaction with Oswald were actually meeting with Kerry Thornley, and this is where this starts to touch upon this stuff. So Joyce introduced me to her professor, saying that she had told him about my book and he was interested in meeting me. At that time, I knew him only as Martin. It was in 1968 that a member of Jim Garrison's staff told me his full name. Martin, to the best of my memory, had brown hair, a pockmarked face. We spent part of an evening, Martin, Joyce, and Jessica and I, sitting in the Bourbon House in the French Quarter, talking about writing in general and the Idle Warriors in particular. Okay, so this pops up a couple times, and I think we'll see this as we go through this document, that Kerry Thornley is often seen here at Bourbon House, right? So, and we know Oswald didn't drink. He wasn't fucking social. Didn't hang out with nobody, okay? Oswald's a spook who's being sent around the country doing other things under aliases, right? He has nothing to do with any of this shit. So, anytime you come across somebody who's interacting with fucking Oswald in New Orleans, in this time period, when Oswald's still supposed to be in the fucking Soviet Union until, July of 62 or June of 62, right? Especially if they're seen at places associated with Kerry Thornley, like the Bourbon House, right? So I can recall from having read this document a couple times already that there are other incidents at the Bourbon House where people claim to have met Lee Harvey Oswald. So in my mind, automatically, if we have a Lee Harvey Oswald sighting and they're interacting with somebody and it's at the Bourbon House particularly, you can bet your fucking bottom dollar it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald, it was Kerry Thornley. And Kerry Thornley's repeated statements that he would go to the Bourbon House, and just the fact that everyone at the Bourbon House knew him, is, to me, the proof that that was Oswald. That he was being interpreted as being Oswald, right? So, of course, typical Kennedy researchers will just look at this shit, scratch their head, and be like, I don't know what the fucking deal is. Idiots. Okay. So, at some point shortly thereafter, Martin arranged to meet me in the Bourbon House again. This time he was with a friend of his, Guy Bannister, who was introduced to me as a man with great interest in literature. Again, we discussed my novel. The only detail from this discussion I remember was that Bannister was very favorably impressed when I told him my writing was influenced in part by Sherwood Anderson. Okay, so this entire statement is like... dumb motherfucker. Okay, let me get my dab because I need to fucking get high to fucking talk about this. So this motherfucker here, this is when? This is 1961 still? Are we still talking like July of 61-ish? Is when we were discussing this time frame. And so what you have, by his own admission, is Kerry Thornley meeting Guy Bannister, 2.5 years before the assassination, right? So he's putting... This is criminals are so fucking stupid. If you're not supposed to know a guy, you're not supposed to admit that you know a guy, right? So here he admits he knows a guy when he's not supposed to fucking know a guy. At this point in time, nobody had made the connection that Guy Bannister and Kerry Thornley were working together in New Orleans between 61 and 63. Like this. So, the implications here is that it was not fucking Oswald working at 544 Camp Street, right? It was fucking Kerry Thornley. And then when you bring in the Douglas Jones aspect of it and how Douglas Jones printed the flyers for Kerry Thornley, they had the 544 Camp Street address on it, which here we have Kerry Thornley admitting he knew Guy Bannister going back to mid-61, right? So, do we really believe that it was Oswald who put the fucking stamp on it with 544 Camp Street? No. I'd be willing to bet my fucking life Oswald never stepped foot at 544 Camp Street. And 100% of the sightings of Oswald at 544 Camp Street, or anything pertaining to Oswald at 544 Camp Street, was Kerry Thornley. And here we go with Kerry Thornley's admission that he fucking knew Guy Bannister in mid-61. So, like I said before, this case was tough, not rocket science, difficult, but just needed some fucking perusing. And when you come across facts like this, like Kerry Thornley admitting he knew Guy Bannister 2 years before the assassination, that's fucking significant. What's up? Weezy, you still in the chat? All right. Where was I? All right. Looking like I got 14 viewers out there. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This is going to be a pretty regular occurrence for me as I'm in the final stages of writing my book. And you make no fucking qualms about it. When that book is done, I'm going on vacation for like fucking 10 years. You ain't going to hear a word from me. So I'm getting all this information out as quickly as possible before I fucking dip into the ether. So, back to fucking liar Kerry Thornley and Guy Bannister. So here we go. One more time after I met with Martin in the Bourbon House. This time, for the first time in our conversations, I had some of the chapters from the Idle Warriors with me for Martin to read. Those present this time were Martin, Jessica, and me. Martin read one of those chapters one windy night and became very upset to find that it had a political message in it. He became even more upset when I explained to him the overall message of the entire book. He said that he should not clutter up literature with their half-baked political ideas. He was quite emphatic, even emotional on the score, as if the way I was writing my book was really a personal affront to him of some sort. So, to the 14 people who are currently watching, 10 of you are followers. So, the 4 of you who are not, go set up your damn account and follow me, please. I chanced to see Martin in the Bourbon House, which was then kind of central clearinghouse for a French Quarter social life, a couple of times after that, but we never sat together and talked again. I'm not sure of the significance of this information, except that it indicates that Guy Bannister was interested enough in my book on Oswald to spend a while discussing it with me, and that therefore, by the autumn of '61, the CIA knew I was writing a book on Lee Oswald, who was still in Russia, if they did not know sooner. So, God, just the dumbest motherfucker ever, I swear to God. This is why the CIA gets busted all the time, because they fucking hire dumb fucks like this. So this statement, what the fuck does he do here? He says, I'm not sure the significance of the above information, except that it indicates that Guy Bannister was interested enough in my book on Oswald in like mid-61, right? To spend a while discussing it with me, and that therefore, by the autumn of '61, the CIA knew I was writing a book on Lee Oswald, who was still in Russia, if they did not know sooner. Okay? Or did you hear what he just fucking said? The CIA was aware that he was writing a book on Lee Harvey Oswald 2.5 fucking years before the assassination. Hello. The implications of that are fucking vast. Okay, whoever wrote these notes on... God, I get this on every fucking Garrison file. These motherfuckers. Here we go. Again with the too much information. It's even written right here in the column. Too much! Exclamation, exclamation. Thornley... I can't read what that... Dismisses his... moved about... novel about Oswald with... Oh yeah, this is where fucking Garrison's like freaking out. He's like, holy shit. He's like, this motherfucker discussed his book with fucking Oswald with Bannister, right? That is like, if you understand the relationships going on there and when people should know each other and when people should not know each other, this is at a time when Kerry Thornley should not know Guy Bannister, right? But they fucking do. I mean, this is, God damn it, this is like one of my favorite files in all of the Garrison papers, because he just fucking admits shit he shouldn't be admitting, right? Like, if you're fucking guilty, you say, I don't know what you're talking about, peace out. You don't give him this fucking 10-page statement on all this shit that you just tripped yourself up on. I gotta look into how Kerry Thornley died. He died pretty young, 50 or 60, something like that. And I have a feeling he might have been taken out for being such a dumb shit. Someone who will remember Joyce and Martin is Victor Charles Latham, who was a close friend of mine in New Orleans and who was still living in the New Orleans area in 1968. In December of '61, in December of '61, on a weekend of that month, Gary took Jessica and Slim and me riding in a black car. I've never paid much attention to cars and did not notice the make, but it was a very expensive automobile, and I believe the windows were rolled up and down The windows rolled up and down when the driver pushed a button. Oh, I guess that was a big deal back in 1960, or that was in the 70s when he gave the statement. I hope that you can see how much, extra detail he's giving unnecessarily. This is the one thing I feel like I'm drowning in it as I read this. I believe on Saturday, the four of us went for a ride in the country and may have stopped somewhere and had a picnic under a tree, possibly even the same tree that figured in the abortion pill episode. And I believe it on Sunday that Gary and Slim and I went out to Gary's house, and I think this was my first visit there since it had been completed in the builders. It was definitely on that Saturday that as we were pulling up in front of Slim's place after our ride in the black car, Gary said if I were to choose a political name, it would be Smith, because a Smith forges things. At this point, Slim and I laughed. Before Slim made his joke, though, Gary had seemed quite earnest and intent in what he was saying. What had led up to it was a discussion of the meaning of names of various Russian communist leaders. Now I believe, but I'm not totally certain, that it was also on this weekend that Gary began talking about a book he said he was going to write, for which he said that the working title was Hitler Was a Good Guy. Well, you can't really be that blunt if you're going to fucking write a book called Hitler Was a Good Guy. Sorry. I'm going to write that book eventually. Each chapter was going to fictionally portray what would have happened if one of the other Nazi leaders had gotten into power instead of Hitler, and it was going to be backed up with quotations from their writings. In conjunction with this, Gary also discussed his theory that the secret to Hitler's power was that he had no power. Gary said that Hitler had no branch of the military, no police unit, no government bureaucracy, no union, no criminal organization under his personal and direct control, and that it was for this reason that those who did have such organizations under their control trusted him, whereas they did not trust each other. That's actually not an overly false statement. Hitler, he said, was a compromise candidate. I think we discussed this idea for a book most of the day that Saturday and all afternoon on Sunday. On Sunday, at some point during our conversation, Gary said that Hitler had made one very stupid mistake. He had gone public. Instead of becoming an orator and a holder of government office, Gary said Hitler should have lived the life outwardly of an ordinary German citizen and should have governed through his powerful friends from such a relatively anonymous position in society. Gary asked me if I would do research for him, and I believed he paid me about $10 to do this research. It consisted of me going to the New Orleans Public Library, locating books on Nazi leaders other than Hitler, and writing down their more atrocious ideas. I then gave these notes to Gary and heard little, if anything, about the book after that. I now speculate that these notes were used in conjunction with the Olympia typewriter, upon which I had typed some of the idle warriors to produce the manuscript under my byline, which would be useful at a later date, probably in 1968, for incriminating me. I do not know that any such manuscript ever came to the attention of Jim Garrison or Warren Report critic Harold Weisberg. So Kerry Thornley knew Weisberg. That's very interesting. But should be fairly easy to question them and find out. Both Garrison and Weisberg have been convinced in '68 that I am some kind of fascist. What are these notes here? I can't tell what that says. The Nazi? Is that what that says? Here we go. What's he referring to? On another occasion later on, Slim mentioned to me that Gary was cultivating the friendship of Carlos Marcello. Oh, so here we go. Kerry Thornley saying shit he shouldn't be saying again. So let's take this from the top. Even Garrison knew. Here we go. Checking the records of the New Orleans Public Library might aid in establishing the precise date I checked out books on Nazis. Up at the top, it says, Here we begin something after the CIA's line since the late 1960s with Carlos Marcello circled. Before, during, or shortly after Christmas, Slim said to me, I've got a Christmas present for you. You have ridden in Carlos Marcello's car. He was making a reference to the black car Gary had been driving on the above-described weekend. Slim explained that Gary knew some of the Marcellos. On another occasion, Later on, Slim mentioned to me that Gary was cultivating the friendship of Carlos Marcello. Okay, so let me fucking ask you people a question. If you're involved in the assassination of President Kennedy, and high up on the goddamn list of fucking suspects is Guy Bannister, David Ferrie, Carlos Marcello, all this shit, and then the cops and Jim Garrison come to you and they say, hey, did you kill the president? No, I swear I had nothing to do with it. I swear I only know Guy Bannister and fucking David Ferrie and Carlos Marcello. I only know all these people. I just didn't fucking do it. Give me a fucking break. Like, his handlers, when they got a hold of his fucking statements, must have just shit themselves. And Kerry Thornley had to have been whacked. Had to have been whacked for being so fucking stupid, for making this fucking statement. I can't fucking believe that I'm reading this. This is unfucking real. I hope you people understand he's spilling the fucking beans right here as we go, connecting himself to all these fucking people who he shouldn't admit knowing. People, if you commit a crime, you're supposed to say, I don't know nothing, fuck off. That's it. I know nothing, fuck off. As best I'm able to reconstruct, it was probably sometime during the summer of '62 that Jessica and I were invited to a party at David Ferrie's house. Here we go with David Ferrie. He's connecting himself to all the fucking wrong people. You don't admit anything, because David Ferrie didn't admit knowing him. This incident was totally unimportant to me at the time, and I did not even recall it until 1968, after I had testified in New Orleans before Jim Garrison's grand jury and denied knowing David Ferrie. Okay, screenshot all this. I'm still not sure the event had any significance, but someone Jessica knew at school, I believe, invited us to this party. The only reason I finally did remember it was because someone made a joke about the party being hosted by a homosexual airline pilot named Ferry. I was introduced to Ferry and we shook hands. And so he's claiming this is when? During the summer of '62. Okay, so these motherfuckers in their timelines, right? But he already admitted that he knew fucking Guy Bannister as of, like, what, autumn of '61. But allegedly he's not knowing David Ferrie until here in sometime in '62. Summer of '62. These fucking people just can't keep their story straight. Can't keep their story straight. So, as an ex-cop, it's fucking irritating. Irritating. Because I can't call this motherfucker out to his face because he's dead. All these motherfuckers are dead. You know who's not dead? Alvin Beaubouf. Alvin Beaubouf knows all this shit. He's still alive. He's about 72 years old, living outside New Orleans. He needs to be paid a visit. I was introduced to David Ferrie and we shook hands. I'm nearly sure no significant conversation transpired. I can describe the house if need be and give some details about what happened that evening. It would seem worthwhile to check with Jessica, who probably still lives in New Orleans with her parents, on Freret Street on the right, just before you reach Napoleon Avenue, coming from town, and find out who it was that invited us to that party and whether or not they knew Kirsten or any other principals. So he's dictating the direction that the investigation should go in, right? He's telling Garrison how he should do his fucking job. There we go. That timestamps that. These are all misdirection techniques. I think it was also during the summer of '62 that I saw Margaret on the bus one day. She was no longer living with Slim by then. Whenever it was said, I clearly recall her telling me that Slim had an evil side to his nature and that I should be aware of him. On other occasions, Slim himself told me the same thing in these words. Quote, sometimes I like to go out and just be a son of a bitching evil. Slim also used to say is how it should be, right? From time to time. Now there is something you had better keep in mind about brother-in-law. Here we go, referring to him as brother-in-law, right? Weird about the Jack Valenti brother-in-law, right? So he really is evil. I mean it. He don't mess around, and he is evil. I invariably brushed aside these warnings. I also recall Slim once saying to me, never lie unless you have to, and then make that son of a bitch stick. So the reason I find this so much importance behind his story about brother-in-law and Slim and Gary, right? Gary's brother-in-law? Is Gary brother-in-law? I don't know. Which one of these motherfuckers brother-in-law? So, because I think that there is definitely a connection to Raoul, who was Vincent Calderon Jr., who is actually Jack Valenti's former brother-in-law up until 1961, because he was married to Jack Valenti's sister, Lorraine Valenti Dinerstein. However, this is just ringing in the back of my head. Something is screaming at me that one of these two guys is Vincent Calderon Jr., right? Is Raul. And that would somehow connect to the Jack Valenti brother-in-law gravestone, right? See, this is where, at the deepest levels of research, your fucking mind starts to like have a fucking breakdown because you're trying to make sense of things that just are seemingly obviously connected, but they shouldn't be. And why should there be a connection? But there seemingly is. Or is the connection all in my head and I'm fucking going nuts? Because let me tell you, when you study Kennedy for too long, you will fucking lose your goddamn mind. I swear to God you will. Start to question what the fuck reality even is in the first place. One afternoon, Slim and I were sitting around in his apartment. He said to me, "Don't forget brother-in-law's last name. It is spelled Kirsten. He is a good man to know. Gary Kirsten, spelled Kirstein. Remember that. You might need to call him someday." Okay, so like understanding an interview and interrogation, and then reading this fucking statement from Kerry Thornley, I'm just like, he might as well just say that he's working with intelligence. The last thing I wanted to believe was that Slim's shady brother-in-law would be anyone whose name I would ever need to know for any reason, so I promptly disregarded the advice to remember the spelling of his name. I remembered the spelling of his name, but I disregarded the advice telling me to remember the spelling of his name. Do you see what he's doing here? This is all psychological tactics. Forgetting the entire incident until recently. Here it says, now Thornley has met Ferry as well as Bannister, and it's only the summer of 62, right? So Garrison is fucking freaking out at this point when he comes to realize that the connection is there. What does it say up here? We've begun to pick up 62 here. Okay, so meanwhile, the focus of my own attention was in areas that had progressively less and less to do with Slim and nothing to do with Gary. Quite a while before going to work for the American Photocopy Equipment Company, I had shaved off my beard. So he's claiming to have shaved off the beard prior to October of 61, or the end of 61. And this ends up becoming important because the beard's back in 63. Either if the beard is not back in 63, what the implication is that Perry Russo had actually met and had known Kerry Thornley for fucking years by the time that he had met him at the party in September of 63, where he allegedly claims to have seen Oswald, which in hindsight, when looking at it from that perspective, then he was in on it the whole fucking time and he wasn't being genuine. Then he knew Kerry Thornley the whole fucking time. Motherfucker. All right, let me make a mental note of that so I can go back and revisit that when I get to that. So many of the chapters I've already written I'm not fucking go back and changing shit, right? The books can come out as it is, and anything I have to update, which there isn't really anything. I haven't found anything that I have to change yet. Some things I could expand upon, but like nothing to change. If I do come across anything, like that's going to end up coming out in a second edition, like a year from now. So I'm not really too concerned about updating what I've already got. I'm more concerned about finalizing what I already have. All right, so here we are picking up in 62. Meanwhile, the focus of my own attention was in areas that had progressively less and less to do with Slim and nothing to do with Gary. Quite a while before going to work for American Photocopy Equipment Company, I had shaved off my beard towards the end of 61. I moved from one place on Napoleon Avenue to another one just down the street. On 29 January of 62, I was laid off the job at American Photocopy in January of 62. Okay, in January of 62, making a mental note of that. I was laid off from the job at American Photocopy. In the weeks that followed, I had another difficult period economically. I took a job that didn't work out. I took temporary work. And finally, I got a job as a shoe salesman at Marks Isaac's department store for the WHOL Shoe Company. This job I kept until whenever it was that Lee Oswald returned to the U.S. from the USSR, which would be June of 62. So he allegedly worked for 6 months. As a shoe salesman at the Mark Isaac's department store. Lee Oswald worked as a shoe salesman at Goodies with his mother in... Fuck, what year was that? Fuck, I don't know. I'll have to look it up. You see, these things are relevant because who was working at what shoe store when... it might seem like random ideas when you're just kind of briefly covering it like this, but if you would actually sit down and put down on paper the dates the dates according to when everybody allegedly worked at shoe stores, and look at that compared to when Lee Oswald was over in the fucking USSR, and you'll find that there is some major discrepancies involved with who was working at shoe stores when. Plus, we have the incidents at Pfister Dental Labs where Palmer McBride was working with Lee Oswald, and then later when Garrison ends up talking to Lee Oswald, talks to Palmer McBride refused to identify Lee Oswald and the mother that we know of as Margarita Oswald as those people, right? So he was obviously introduced to the duplicate Lee Oswald and his mother. So, but that's a whole nother tangent I'll get into another time. This here just solidifies when he claims he was working at a shoe store in the first half of January, from January to June of 62, possibly July of 62. But, so what do you have to do to debunk that? All I have to do is find some Oswald incidents in New Orleans that would contradict with his work schedule, right? And that's not hard to do either. I maybe not today, but I have on another day. We'll go over Weisberg's false Oswald files, and you'll see as we go through those, like all of those dates in those files contradict what timelines we have here. You know, so Thornley's lying this fucking ass off in this statement. Anytime someone gives you an overly fucking detailed explanation of a defense, they're fucking lying. Period. Anyone who's actually accused of something they didn't do should get angry and be like, I didn't do it, fuck off. End of story. So sometime in the early spring of 62, Jessica and I broke up for all practical purposes, though we dated from time to time afterwards and tried to get it back together. Okay, let's analyze this statement and look at the intelligence work here in this statement. Sometime in the early spring of 1962, Jessica and I broke up for all practical purposes. Well, did they break up or not? Well, they broke up for practical purposes. Right? What does that mean? Though we dated from time to time afterwards. So we broke up for all practical purposes, though we dated from time to time afterwards. That statement says nothing. Like, literally, that statement says nothing at all. And then here it says, I think David Ferry's party was one of these occasions. Okay, so here we go. Boom. We are back to the fucking party at... So now we have Kerry Thornley placing himself at the party that Perry Russo later talks about, right? So when he talks about David Ferry's party, this is the only fucking party that has any relevance. There were other parties that are referenced prior to this with the Civil Air Patrol and shit, but totally irrelevant. So here in this context, when you're talking about, I think David Ferry's party was one of these occasions, what the fuck you're talking about is the party that Perry Russo went to. And everyone was at this fucking party, right? So everyone, Clay Shaw was there, fucking, I have a feeling Seymour Hall and Lawrence Howard were there because they were fucking unidentified Cubans. I mean, there's a couple of guys that people always bring up, like Louis Rebel, who like really had fucking nothing to do with nothing. So yeah, I kind of put two and two together that fucking all the guys were at this party in September. Why did they have this party and invite people who were fucking seemingly on the outskirts of this tight group? And why did they fucking sloppily talk about shooting the president? Because they're fucking dumb, right? They were sloppy. Like when you finally come to grips with what happened in the assassination, you find that all these motherfuckers were just sloppy. They were sloppy. And a lot of motherfuckers should have fucking figured this shit out a long time ago. Period. So, in autumn of 62, after another spate of temporary jobs and semi-starvation, and I got a job as a busboy. So why did he circle semi-starvation? Why did he, and with 2 exclamation points? Why? Well, we know that Kerry Thornley was 2 to 3 inches taller than Oswald. Oswald came in, we're not really sure because the fucking documentation is so off, but he was probably 5'7" to 5'8". Kerry Thornley was closer to 5'9", possibly 5'10", but all of the descriptors and all the fucking paperwork is all fucked. Nobody really knows for sure. But it's important because if Kerry Thornley had to lose a whole bunch of fucking weight, why did he have to lose semi-starvation? He could have lost a whole bunch of weight to try to get back down to Oswald's build, which he would have had to have been in by November of 63. So I got a job at a busboy and then as a waiter at the Sheraton Charles Hotel. Was confirmed FBI. I think that's what that says. At about the same time, I found a small room for $20 a month at the corner of Royal and Dumaine in the Quarter. And so this is in the autumn of '62. This is about a month after Oswald got back from Soviet Union. I cannot ascertain exactly when it was that Gary and I discussed assassinating the president. I'm sorry, hang on a second. Let me back this up. I cannot ascertain exactly when it was that Gary and I discussed assassinating President John F. Kennedy, but it must have been at least several months after the weekend of riding in Carlos Marcello's car, and would have had to have been before I left town for a visit to California in early May of 1963. I don't know. Maybe this needs a fucking screenshot. What do you think? Let me grab all of this. Boom. This makes me fucking harken back to people like Michael Shermer and all these other fucking lone gunmen fucking nuts who are like, there's just no evidence that anybody else had anything to do with this. Let me reread this. I cannot ascertain exactly when it was that Gary and I discussed assassinating President John F. Kennedy, but it must have been at least several months after the weekend of riding in Carlos Marcello's car, and would have been have to have been before I left town for a visit in California in the May of '63. Yes, like, what the fuck, people? Ridiculous, right? So he knows that Garrison will never be able to trace him back to the assassination. Ever. Under any fucking circumstances. They'll never be able to put him in Dallas, even though he shot J.D. Tippit and all that stuff. And Garrison will eventually get the reports from the Texas Theater showing that two men were arrested out of the Texas Theater, went out the front, went out the back. Garrison eventually will know all this stuff. Probably by the time of this fucking statement. But for him to... If you've ever actually killed the president, if you actually plot to kill the president, you deny it, deny it, deny it. Like, for him to even make statements like this is like... He's taunting them to some degree. All right. Sorry, let me fucking read through these chats because I've been busy working on this. So, thank you for some of the nice comments. RN, you're always fucking the man. Yes, that is the question. Was that Raul? Possible. Definitely possible. See, Raul's in the mix and all this stuff, and he uses other names too. He used the name of Dago. He used, what else? Who knows? Those are the two I know of, Raul and Dago, and his real name was Vincent Calderon Jr., so who the fuck knows? That all came about through the statements of Glenda Grabo on her information. I don't know if she gave information to Garrison or who the fuck she talked to, but she was another strung out junkie hooker who was in with these guys. They always hung out with hookers. Gary did not accept or reject your comment upon this idea, but simply gave Slim an extremely pleased, significant look. The suggestion I made was one someone had made to me at some earlier time. I speculate that it could have been made by someone working for Gary, an anti-Castro soldier of fortune passing through the Bourbon House, for example, but I'm not sure where I heard it. I am now pretty sure that Gary was taping this session and that its main purpose was to set me up for future incrimination should that become necessary. The conversion went on along the same pattern of Gary asking me for assassination ideas and me supplying them for a short while until I ran out of ideas. When that happened, Gary quipped his typically cheerful manner, and next we'll get Martin Luther King. And they sure as fuck did, didn't they? I vigorously opposed the idea of killing King. The question now becomes, was Kerry Thornley involved in that? And I'm going to have to say probably not. Once you're involved in an operation like this, the CIA is pretty much going to fucking make you persona non grata. I recall only 2 of the suggestions I made. Or, hold on, what does this say up in the corner here? It says, like, I can't read the first part, but 2 is, first one is probably says Oswald, 2 probably is Thornley, and then it says Marines, C equals name something intel. Name maybe / intel? Well, anyway, it gives the indication that Garrison knew that there was somehow a connection here between Thornley and intel, which is fucking obvious. So I recall only 2 of the suggestions I made. The first involved a method of poisoning with a chemical that would blow his stomach apart, and another involved the use of a remote control model airplane. Or rocket with a bomb in it. Gary's response was, as best I recall, pretty much the same each time. No comment to speak of, just a smile in Slim's direction. At one point, Slim interjected, remember what I told you about brother-in-law, Kerry. So here we go. He's referring to him directly as the name brother-in-law. I'm going to bring up that fucking... I'm going to bring this up again. Just because I fucking feel there's a connection here somewhere. I mean, so let's run through this again, because my mind is stuck on this. So I got to work through this at some point. So you have fucking Kerry Thornley talking about brother-in-law, right? The guy has a nickname of brother-in-law, right? And so I'm trying to fit a fucking maybe I'm trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Who knows? I might be wrong, but there's just too much there for there to not be any there, right? So you got Kerry Thornley talking about brother-in-law as a nickname of this fucking guy. We have Jack Valenti, who was the shooter on the grassy knoll, who I know has other family members named Jack Valenti, and this is probably one of them, even though I did a partial genealogy on this guy, and I could not find this guy was this Jack Valenti was ever married, but there's other things that I kind of I want to connect, but I don't know if I want to go into it or not. Like, so after the shots are fired from the grassy knoll, you have the person who ran with a rifle into the railroad yards who ends up getting arrested by Joe Smith, right? That person, I don't know if they were the second suspect who was held for 3 weeks, or whether or not that was Emilio Santana, who was arrested out front of the Daltex in front of the school book depository, right? So I have to figure out the identity of the man who ran from the shooter on the grassy knoll into the railroad yards, obviously to distract people from where the shooter actually went, which was over the top of the grassy knoll into the Secret Service car, right? So my suspicion is that this person might be this Jack Valenti, right? Like they set up another Jack Valenti, which ended up getting arrested and held. Maybe that was like part of the deal, like it was insurance. I don't know. This is where my brain starts to fucking melt, because I just don't know, but there's just too much there to not have any there, right? So... all right, moving on. Okay, I'll read this part again. At one point, Slim interjected, remember what I told you about brother-in-law, Kerry. Don't forget his name. He's a good man to know. Briefly, Gary and I discussed his name, how to spell it, what it meant in German, and the meaning of another German name, Steinkopf, a man who had been in MACS 9 back when I knew Oswald. Another thing Gary asked me at one point was what I thought of bringing Jimmy Hoffa into this thing. Like, what the fuck is he doing? What is he doing? Why is he name dropping all these fucking people? Why? Another thing Gary asked me to point at this point was what I thought of bringing Jimmy Hoffa into this thing. I said I thought it would be a good idea, that Hoffa was being persecuted by Robert Kennedy, and I thought that he was a good man. Here we have in parentheses, standard, false something. I can't tell what that says. I think it was also during this discussion that I asked Gary what he had done during the war. He made the statement more than once, and I think this was about the second or third time that he had other Midwesterners or German background had been sent to the Pacific Theater out of fear they would collaborate with Germans if sent to Europe. I believe, but am not absolutely certain, that Gary told me he was in naval intelligence And he had spent his time on a ship in the Pacific, possibly on Guam, monitoring radio broadcasts, right? So this is like some deep level research for like way in the future. Yeah, I can cut it right there. Now, you know, like a good disinformation agent provides you mostly true information with just a little bit of false stuff sprinkled in there. Who the fuck knows how much of this is true that Kerry Thornley is spinning here? These discussions definitely took place after the UN had sent Congolese troops into Katanga, because that was also one of the things we talked about as good reason for hating Kennedy. At another point, Gary said, I think a good form of government would be where each interest group elected representatives, each industry, each union, and so on, outlining the fascist corporate state, finally asking, don't you think that would be a good form of government? I said, yes. And then remember that Gary had told me once before that this was fascism, which I certainly did not think was a, quote, good form of government. But by the time Gary was smiling as if extremely satisfied with getting me to make that particular answer to that particular question, so I let it pass. So he's talking about how this guy was manipulating conversations, right? Like, I just don't understand. During most of these discussions, I had been sitting by the door or squatting in the center of the room, and Gary had been sitting at the end of the room opposite the door on a sofa. Slim, who had said very little the whole time, was sitting to my right and Gary's left on one side of the room. Finally, there came a time when I had a definite feeling the discussion was over. I couldn't figure it out. Gary and Slim had been acting very odd, saying little, giving one another significant looks, smiling at what seemed to be inappropriate moments. Some of the time, for a moment of two now and then, I would get the idea where they were really what the fuck word is that? They were, serious. Okay, serious about all this. Then one or the other of them would say something or would fail to comment, and I would get the idea they were just playing games. I think I probably wondered whether or not Gary had maybe bet Slim that I would be enthusiastic about killing Kennedy, hence the significant smiles and failures to develop any of my suggestions. I think Slim sanitized the incident by telling me it was the result of a bet a few days later. Okay, this is a great comment. 100% intelligence community phrase. Absolutely not generally known. So Kerry Thornley is using fucking intel verbiage, right? This is great. Love this. I think I probably wondered whether or not Gary had maybe bet Slim that I would be enthusiastic about killing Kennedy, hence the significant smiles and failure to develop any of my suggestions. I think Slim sanitized the incident by telling me it was the result of a bet a few days later. Boom. And he gives himself away for the 100th fucking time. By this time, Gary was standing up near the center of the room, and Slim was standing next to him, I believe, probably making ready to terminate the visit. Gary said, I think the best way to pull off a political assassination and get away with it would be to have many people involved, but kept under the illusion that they were pursuing other goals. Don't you think that it would be a good idea, Kerry? My answer was affirmative, but in order to do that, you would have to have control of a very large bureaucracy. I agreed privately. Why is that handwritten in there? Concluding somewhat disappointedly that this was indeed nothing but a bull session, since Kennedy was president, and to my way of thinking at the time, he obviously had control of all the bureaucracies. Gary smiled again, looking very pleased. Slim also had a pleased expression on his face. So, like, as I'm reading through this, and I've read this a couple times before, so I kind of, the analogy I'll make is like, someone's accusing you of robbing the bank. And you're saying, I didn't rob the bank. I mean, I drove there. I fucking went through the front doors. I pulled out the gun. I held it to the fucking cashier's head. I said, give me all your money. He put it in the bag, and I had it in my hand. I walked out the door, but I didn't rob the bank. I just did all these things. And then I realized I didn't want to do all this stuff. So then I realized I was just daydreaming. And I fucking went home, and I didn't do it. That's what he's doing here in this fucking statement here, right? So, like, he's confessing without confessing, and he's giving them a ton of details that they're going to have to investigate, that they're going to spin off in a million directions and take fucking years to debunk. The level of training this guy had in counter-interrogation or anti-interrogation is unfucking believable. But in order to do that, you would have to control a very large bureaucracy, blah, blah, blah. I already read that part. I believe it was at this point that I made the suggestion of sending someone out to lead the opposition around in circles so an assassination would not be solved. Hold on a second. Did he just really say that? I believe it was at this point that I made the suggestion of sending someone out to lead the opposition around in circles so an assassination would not be solved. This motherfucker actually said this to Garrison's investigators. To my mind, this was an alternative to the rather cumbersome notion Gary had expressed about using many people. I had gotten this idea from the talent scout by Romain Gary, in which a Latin American dictator sends out one of his henchmen to lead a revolution against him in order to discover who is against him. I'd given this book to Slim to read, and Gary seemed familiar with the idea. In the book, the henchman proves not to be so loyal to the dictator after all and leads a successful revolution against him instead. Gary said this was the trouble with that idea, that such is exactly what happens. Whoever you send out just goes over to the other side. But at this point, I am not sure whether he actually rejected the idea or just pretended to reject it for the sake of security. Another thing I said at that time, cross that, was this again, was that if I took part in an assassination, I would afterwards have myself hypnotized to forget my role. What the fuck is this guy doing? This thought has come back to haunt me many times over the years, but I do not believe this is what happened. Slim and I were now standing at the door preparing to leave. Gary said, "Only one problem remains. Who to frame for it? I figure some jailbird." I asked him why frame anyone for it. He said, "People need answers." I then asked, why frame a jailbird? Gary said something to the effect that people who get caught are inferior and don't deserve any breaks. I objected to this line of thinking. Gary said, "Well, who would you frame for it?" I think I probably said, "Well, why not frame some communist?" Gary smiled. Why not frame some communist? Remember, this is a guy who knew Oswald starting in 1959 in the Marines at Del Toro, then at Atsugi, then, if I'm not mistaken, again at the Language Institute at Monterey, and then finds out that Oswald defects to the Soviet Union. He then writes a book about fucking Oswald, who defected to the Soviet Union, who became a communist. And now here we are approaching the assassination in 1963, and he's having a conversation on why don't we just blame a communist in his plans to assassinate the president with Gary, Kirstein, and Slim. Do you not see a problem with this fucking story that he's telling? It's got me going in circles. I don't know what the fuck to think of it. I promise you, Garrison didn't know what the fuck to do with it either. And that was the point of it. Another possibility, hold on a second. Another possibility about when this discussion might have taken place had occurred to me. It could have transpired sometime shortly after my return to New Orleans from California and Mexico City in September of '63. Okay, here we go. Who the fuck went to Mexico City in September of 1963? Allegedly the Oswald, right? But here we go. We have another admission here from Kerry Thornley. Another possibility about when this discussion might have taken place has occurred to me. It could have transpired sometime shortly after my return to New Orleans from California and Mexico City in September of 1963. Hello. Kerry Thornley admitted that he went to fucking Mexico City in September of 1963. When was Oswald allegedly in Mexico City? September 26th of 1963. I have more evidence that it was Kerry Thornley who went to Mexico City and not fucking Lee Oswald, because on the way back on October 4th, a date that Oswald was allegedly already back in fucking Dallas, where he allegedly met with Laura Cottrell at the fucking Texas Employment Commission, but that was actually Larry Crawford, believe it or not, who was impersonating Oswald that time. That was on October 4th. So the official story tried to paint the picture that Oswald was back in fucking Dallas by October the 4th. Okay? However, I have documents showing that numerous places along the way between the border at, was it Brownsville? I forget what city. But from one of those border towns, from crossing the border back from Mexico City, where he was riding a bus, gets off, had a car waiting for him with a woman who had a child. And then by October 4th, this person who claims to have been Lee Harvey Oswald, obviously it was Kerry Thornley, and Marina and the child, because, well, Marina and the child knew Kerry Thornley, and actually there was a witness who said that they saw Kerry Thornley at Oswald's place in New Orleans so often that they weren't sure which one of the two guys was married to her, right? So we have a definite connection between Kerry Thornley and Marina, right? Which this will be in my book for sure. I still have to get to this chapter, which is why we're talking today. But that will be in this chapter in the fucking book. I'll go over the details. I don't think I can go over it today. But yeah, so I have no doubts it was Kerry Thornley who knew Marina. Kerry Thornley was seen all over Dallas with Marina setting Oswald up, talking about going to the gun store, shooting rifles at fucking bales of hay, all kinds of stuff like that. So the fact that he admits that he went to motherfucking Mexico City in September 63, then I have him October 4th in Alice, Texas, applying for a job at a radio station where he's seen again with a fucking woman and a child. This directly connects to the Clinton incident where Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly goes to register to vote, which I'm not even going to get into that story. Motherfuckers who actually think that that was Oswald ignored the entire backstory to that. So that was clearly Kerry Thornley also, because number one, he's seen driving, and number two, he's seen with a fucking pregnant woman at the time, right? So yeah, clearly that was Kerry Thornley this whole fucking time. This whole time. All right, so where the fuck am I? I do not know how many times I visited Gary's home. Each time was with Slim and as few as 2 visits. Each time was with Slim and as few as 2 visits, or as many as 4 or 5 might have taken place. My basic impression is that there were only 2, but I have some memory fragments. He has memory fragments. How nice. I wish I had memory fragments of exchanges with Gary. And then he must have put a correction in here. This is incorrect speculation. I'm now almost sure the talk took place 2 or 3 weeks before the assassination, and it was that Slim's telling me I had made him lose $10 that caused me... Oh, okay. So he gives a statement here, and then he, in the same fucking paragraph, corrects his own shit, right? This is meant to do nothing but spin motherfuckers in circles. So here we go. Let me cut all this. This will all be important. So let me reread all of this. Another possibility about when this discussion might have taken place has occurred to me. It could have transpired sometime shortly after my return to New Orleans from California and Mexico City in September of 1963. I know that on the day of the assassination, it was already an old memory because it was not fresh in my mind enough to cause me to even begin to suspect Gary or Slim of being involved. Okay. God, this fucking statement has so much to unpack. I do not know how many times I visited Gary's home. Each time was with Slim, and as few as 2 visits, or as many as 4 or 5 might have taken place. My basic impression is that there were only 2, but I have some memory fragments or exchanges with Gary that I can't fucking seem to fit into that. This motherfucker. So he goes out and says all this in September of 63, but then he says, no, this is incorrect speculation. I'm now almost sure that it took place 2 or 3 weeks before the assassination, so that would put it in November of 63. Huh. The point I'm making here with going over this part in particular is that he's contradicting himself all over the place intentionally so as to throw the investigators off their game. But the bottom line is, whoever the fucking Garrison had on this would have done what I did with the investigation and gone through it with a fine-tooth comb and put it in chronological order. And then when you do that, you'll be able to just basically debunk the entire fucking thing. You'll be like, well, this doesn't make any sense because your statements here contradict this, contradict this, contradict this. But it will buy him, what it does is it buys him time. And then, thanks to his counter-interrogation training, he'll be like, oh, it's been 10 years, I don't remember. If you're guilty, just say, I don't know shit, fuck off. That's the moral of the story. So... he goes into that as incorrect. In his living room, which I cannot attribute with certainty either of the visits, I remember in detail. However, these are exchanges which could have taken place on either of the two visits or upon some less memorable visit. Before covering the miscellaneous memory fragments, I want to... Before covering these miscellaneous memory fragments, I want to note one other interchange, which I am fairly oh my god, I swear to God, this fucking thing is driving me. I'm going crazy just reading this statement. Interchange, which I am fairly certain took place on the day of the assassination discussion and which was left out of the foregoing because of oversight. Gary and I talked about who would make a good president, and his choice was Nixon. Goldwater seemed like a more logical choice to me, although I already knew that Gary didn't like Goldwater because he classified Goldwater as Jewish. And I mentioned him. Gary replied, "Oh, don't talk to me about that raving red." I have so far been unable to remember his reasons for preferring Nixon, like more irrelevant nonsense. Among the exchanges which I cannot place was one fairly long argument about Jim Garrison in which all three of us took part. This was not a heated argument. I don't recall ever seeing Gary appear angry, but merely a disagreement. Gary did not like Garrison, and in those days I did. I kept asking him for those reasons and then picking... Hold on a second. Back up. I don't recall ever seeing Gary appear angry, but merely a disagreement. Gary did not like Garrison, and in those days I did. What? So Garrison didn't get involved with Kennedy till after 1967. So now we have Thornley associating himself with Gary, who might possibly have been Raoul, after 1967, unless he's referring to Garrison in the days when he was just a fucking DA. But why would he come up? Like, when was the last time you had a conversation with somebody and then talked about the local DA? Never. Fucking never. Finally, he said, in a very lighthearted manner, the real reason he hated Garrison was because he wears a vest. He stated that he had told him he wanted a coworker at the brewery and the man to really crack up laughing. Whenever it was that he quit at the brewery shortly thereafter, he told how on the day he decided to resign, he walked up behind someone who worked there that he didn't like and jumped up and kicked a man in the back of the head with both feet. It sounded like a difficult stunt to pull off. Then Gary said he went to the office and turned in his resignation. He said on a couple of occasions that while he considered black people to be subhuman, there were some, quote, niggers who were all right. One of these was a man who worked at the brewery in some low-status job, I believe, and knew how to, quote, keep in his place. I recall telling Jessica that Gary was telling me stories about Papa Joe Conforto, but I did not remember any of these stories or actually remember Gary telling them to me. Gary had many stories to tell about the various Nazi leaders, which I remember, but am not recording here because I don't think they are relevant. What? For once, he finds something not fucking relevant. Unbelievable. To the warrant, the time and place it would take. I am sure that at some point during the discussions with Gary, I must have mentioned that it was a little known fact that people could indeed be hypnotized to kill. I had read this in a book by a professor in the state of Washington who had been conducting experiments with hypnotized subjects. They could be induced, it was found, to throw what they thought was acid on someone. Among the people Gary mentioned hating, in addition to Jews and blacks, were so many others that it was a joke between the three of us. Once when Slim was laid up in the hospital with TB for a while, I went to visit him. That's another thing. Here we go. So we don't know who the Slim is, but he says he had TB and was in the hospital. Therefore, if we ever can come up with a suspect, we might be able to find some kind of record that they had TB or were in the hospital. It's kind of how you would connect the dots on that. It had such listings as, quote, Jewish people and, quote, people with glasses and, quote, bald people. Gary himself being bald and so forth. That's another clue. Gary being bald. Was he really bald? Was he going bald? Was he partially bald? Who knows? The original description wasn't that he was bald, but that he was going bald, right? So that matches the description of Raoul. This was one of the things that lulled me into thinking Gary was not serious about the other things he said. I believe, but I'm not certain, that Gary said members of his family were active in the German-American Bund, but in the Midwest during the 30s. Another thing that happened out at the house was Gary told me Hitler said that one should never make the mistake of assuming people are any stupider than they really are. I am sure I have a lot of other little fragmented memories like this that lying around in my mind. Some of them may be important. I haven't the other sources of information in terms of which to evaluate on the basis of what I understand at this point about the overall Kennedy murder operation. I have covered everything significant about Gary Kirstein that I recall from the period between April of 61. Here we go with some fucking dates, which are the most important shit in the world. April of 61 to whenever it was that we saw each other before I left town in December of 63. So he's referring here to Gary, but earlier he just referred to Gary as having had disagreed with the statements of Jim Garrison, right? But again, were they just talking about the local fucking DA, or was that in 67 or beyond? See, he's like, when you lie, you can't keep your story straight, and that's exactly what's going on here. Okay, so this is hilarious. Now I feel that I should backtrack and update the progress of the Idle Warriors. So he has like all these paragraphs about him jumping around in time, but now he's going to backtrack. Just fucking hilarious. Hilarious. You ever known people like this? It makes you just want to punch them in the fucking face. Now I feel I should backtrack and update the progress of the Idle Warriors. After that, I should include a chronology of my relationship with Slim. I just postponed writing the last chapter of the Idle Warriors until Joyce finished typing most of the rest of the final draft. This must have been in early 1962. I was hesitant to do this chapter because it dealt with an investigation of the main character's defection to the USSR, and I had only heard rumors of the investigation that was conducted at El Toro after Oswald's defection. Hold on a second. So, screenshot, because we have some time discrepancy here going on. Okay, so here we have, I had no firsthand knowledge of it. My preference would have been to, here we go, it says, I had only heard rumors of the investigation that was conducted at El Toro after Oswald's defection. But see, here's the problem. Like, Kerry Thornley should not have been at El Toro after Oswald's fucking defection, because he went from El Toro, from there he went to Atsugi. Oswald was fucking Atsugi. So Kerry Thornley was not at El Toro when fucking Oswald defected. So why does Kerry Thornley have knowledge of anything that was going on at El Toro? He's not alleged to have ever been fucking stationed there after he left. You see the fucking problem here? I would suggest he probably was at El Toro. That probably was his home base the whole fucking time. And he probably had to go there and check in. And that's probably how the fuck he could make that statement. Because he had been back to El Toro. Despite the fact that the official fucking record of him doesn't place him there after he initially left. See, this is where these dumb motherfuckers, man, they don't realize that 50 years later they're going to have some fucking tool called the internet that could fucking, just put all the pieces in front of us. I first sent the book's manuscript to Charles Tuttle and Sons in Vermont, who published a lot of books about Japan, having a Tokyo office, I believe. They rejected it. I next sent it, in all probability, to Helen Curtis Brown literary agents because another friend of Joyce Talley's named Saul Gottlieb. Saul Gottlieb. Interesting. Why he would bring up that name. Gottlieb was the head of the fucking MK Ultra program. And that was, what was Gottlieb's first name? Someone in the chat, anybody remember Gottlieb's first name, the head of MK Ultra? So after a while, I lost hope of selling the manuscript, turned my attention to other things. Occasionally someone would recommend an agent or publisher. I would give them a try. It seems to me that someone recommended Max Schulman at some point. That name rang a bell recently when I ran across it, and Robert Byron Watson's statement on the King assassination. So he's now connecting himself to people who are connected to the King. Like, he's putting himself in the middle of the story, right? If you haven't been able to determine what he's doing, he's making himself the innocent victim at the center of this entire conspiracy. One person who recommended several publishers and or agents to me was William can't read that. Delphi's or Bill Schmidt, his real name. Schmidt. Why would he give someone's fake name and then give the real name? He's maybe trying to appear like he's more knowledgeable than he actually is. Who the fuck knows? Schmidt had established the theater in the theater Dell, whatever the fuck word that is, in New York, and was in New Orleans at least by late '62, attempting to start a professional theater. One of the people working for him for so long time was Vic Latham. Heavy on the name dropping with this fucking guy. I also worked for Schmidt for a while and was one of the few people who didn't wind up getting ripped off by him. Lorraine Sinkler, more names, who was working for Jim Garrison by 1968, also worked for Schmidt at that time. What does any of this have to do with his involvement in the assassination? Nothing. He's drowning you in nonsense. I met a New York promoter by the name of Jerry one night on a bus, and it seems to me he was also associated with Schmidt in some way. As I recall, Jerry recommended a publisher for the Idle Warriors that night on the bus, and that may have been Max Schulman. I don't know what Jerry's last name was. By the spring of '63, the Idle Warriors was permanently on the shelf, and I had decided to become a poet instead of a novelist. So he's claiming by spring of '63, which is like, let's say, March. Idle Warriors was shelved. He decided he was not going to do anything with it. And then he gets news that Oswald had returned from the Soviet Union in 1962. So he, according to him, he doesn't know Oswald is back in New Orleans until spring of '63. However, Oswald got back in June of '62. We have evidence that Oswald was in New Orleans in June of '62. We have evidence that Kerry Thornley was in New Orleans in June of '62. I think, depending on how much longer I go today, we might get to it today. Maybe we'll get to it tomorrow. But putting himself back in New Orleans in by the spring of '63, the Idle Warrior was permanently, and then he gets news of Oswald, right? So it's after the spring of '62. So let's say it's, let's say March or April, right? Well, it was was it April 9th or was it August 9th? No, it wasn't until August that we had the incident out on the street corner with Carlos Bernier and Oswald, which obviously Kerry Thornley played a part in the setup of that because he was obviously Oswald's handler since he had given him the flyers that were printed at Jones Printing. So, yeah, he's making claims that he didn't know Oswald was back until, let's just say safely, April of '63. All I need to do is put the two of them together, which I can, thanks to Harold Weisberg's files and the statements of what the fuck was Kerry Thornley's girlfriend's name, Jessica. Jessica made statements that she saw them together all the time during that time period. So he's fucking lying. Yeah, let me screenshot that motherfucker. I'll just take half this fucking page. It's all going to be related. But in the spring of '63, okay, all right. I'm going to do another screenshot here. This is super duper fucking important. He's dropping CIA names at this point, all right? Here we go. All right, all these names are going to be super important. The most important being Clint Bolton. All right, so Clint Bolton, we're definitely CIA guy. And obviously it was known by Garrison because Garrison underlined it here. But in the spring of 1963, Clint Bolton entered my life and began a campaign to change all of this. Change all of what? I don't know. So, let me back up a little. When I got the news that Oswald had returned from Soviet Union in '62, I quit my job at Mark Isaacs as a shoe salesman in order to get a part-time job and start rewriting the Idle Warriors with the idea in mind that when I reached the last chapter this time around, I would go to Dallas and visit Lee and find out directly from him all the details I would need to set the conclusion to the book in Moscow, but I was never able to get my economic life in shape enough to do this, in order to do this, the rewrite, let alone make the trip to Dallas. And by the time I went to work at the Sheraton Charles Sheraton, I was heavily into poetry and ready to resign the Warriors to oblivion, but in the spring of 63, Clinton Bolton entered my life and began a campaign to change all this. So, why are people coming into Kerry Thornley's fucking life in order to help him make this book about Oswald, who isn't even known by anybody allegedly yet? This is so ridiculous. This whole story is fucking ridiculous. Just remember this name, Clint Bolton. This name, Clint Bolton, will be very fucking important. Loy and Camp, a fellow poet named Joel Cohen, and Dave Carpenter and I were sitting in a bar one night, and Joel and I were taking turns reading our poems. Aw, how cute. Clint somewhat drunkenly butted in while I was reading one of mine and began to pester me. I behaved very rudely towards him, which didn't seem to faze him. He just stayed there and kept punching, and we wound up alone together in another bar talking about Pindar by sunrise. That morning, back at Clint's house, I told him about the Idle Warriors. He said he could tell by the tone of my voice that the Warriors was what I should be writing instead of a bunch of Tuesday afternoon stuff, which is what he called my poetry. When we got through talking that morning, he said to me, "Go home and write, you bum." So all these people who worked for the fucking CIA at one point, Dave Barry, Guy Bannister, and you'll see how Clint Bolton ends up working for the fucking CIA. No relation to Bolton Ford, from what I can tell, which is the event that happened in 61. So, but he's got all these people coming to him, wanting to encouraging him to get this book out, and he's a big deal because he's written this book about Oswald, but nobody allegedly knows who Oswald is yet because this is a year before the assassination, right? So none of this is making any fucking sense. I don't know if I started a rewrite of the Warriors then or not, but if I did, I quickly lost interest and was back to my poems and vignettes. Clint spent hours explaining to me that I should be writing a novel, not poems. Let me stop real quick, because this, I caught something else as I was going through this, as far as timing goes. He said here that he found out about Oswald having come back from the Soviet Union in the spring of 63, but then he says he was going to go to Dallas to meet Oswald, but never did. But see, Oswald left Dallas by April of 63 and returned to New Orleans and was there until until September 26th of 63, right? When he allegedly goes to fucking Mexico City, and then ends up in Dallas, but he was still in New Orleans on the 26th because that's when he closed out his P.O. box. I have the documents showing that. And then he ends up back in Dallas after he allegedly returns from Mexico City, which was on October the 4th. But what the fuck was Oswald really doing that whole week? Who the fuck knows? Nobody knows. He's a fucking ghost. But the point I'm making here is that Oswald was motherfucking back in New Orleans by April. So Thornley knew this the whole time. This whole story is bullshit. Clint spent hours explaining to me that I should be writing a novel, not poems. I had a couple of other novel projects on my mind, which I had never really gotten started. And once in a while, I would go to work on one of these. But then Clinton would come up with reasons why I should be working on the Idle Warriors instead. See, so all these motherfuckers are getting him encouraged to write this fucking book. It's total fucking nonsense. The other thing that Clint insisted on was that, yes, Sidney Gottlieb, thanks for that. The other thing Clint insisted on was that I should leave my politics out of my writing. Yet I realized that without the political message, the Warriors would be all but pointless. During these discussions in which Clint would become extremely eloquent and of which he never seemed to tire, we spoke a great deal about my character, Johnny Shelburne, who was drawn in part from Oswald. Johnny Shelburne. Interesting. That should be my fucking alias when I go on the run from the cops when they come for me. Clint saw Shelburne as a bitter, lonely, alienated man to a greater extent than I did. Our relationship continued along these lines until I left for California in May of 63. and resumed where it left off as soon as I got back in September. So here's the problem with his statement here, and you can tell Garrison knew what the fuck time it was. He had it circled, underlined, and arrows written at it, okay? This is the problem. So this time frame involving Kerry Thornley, where he says to have left in May of 63. So, right, so he finds out that Oswald is back. And let's adjust the timeline here. He finds out Oswald is back in March of 1963, and he wants to go visit him in Dallas. But we know it had to have been March because Oswald is actually back in New Orleans by April of 63. Okay? But then allegedly, he never sees Oswald, and then he leaves again, right? So Oswald is allegedly in Dallas, and then in New Orleans, and then Dallas, and then New Orleans. And at the same time, that fucking that Kerry Thornley is in New Orleans, but then he goes on a trip, and then he gets back from his trip in September, and that is when Oswald leaves. So it's like him and leaves again. So it seems as though Kerry Thornley and Oswald are doing this dance where they're coming and going around the same time, but allegedly none of them are in the same city at the same time, but of course they're both in the same city at the same fucking time. See, this was some weak planning on their part. And so, but yeah, it's circled here because when he says he got back from the trip in September 63, he already admitted that he was in Mexico City in September 63, right? In the previous paragraph. Therefore, it was obviously him coming back, so he didn't get back in September. He obviously got back October 4th, but then did he go to fucking New Orleans at all? I don't know, because I've got him attempting to set up Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas. Definitely November. I have to double check the dates. Maybe October. But if not, then we can clearly state that he did go back to New Orleans. But it wasn't September. Clearly was not September. The earliest was October the 5th. But at the fucking earliest. So he's lying here again. Clint was consistent. He always wanted me to work on a novel rather than poetry, and The Idle Warriors rather than one of my other novel projects. Sometime in the autumn of 63, Clint started reading the Idle Warriors manuscript and making specific suggestions for rewrite. His favorite chapter was Soledad, and one night in the Bourbon House, he got the novelist Tom Sankton to read it. He keeps naming all these names, right? Keeps naming specific names. Crazy. He's giving these guys years of people to follow up on. In the autumn of 63, in fact, Clint took an extraordinary interest in me, and in seeing to it that I sat down and wrote. So Clint, who we'll see, was most certainly Clint is his handler. This is the conclusion I came to the first couple times I read this file, because everything that's going on with him when Garrison comes to him. So allegedly he doesn't meet this guy until motherfucking 62, he says, right? But then all of a sudden, every single time anything happens with this case with Garrison later on in 67 and shit, he's coming back to him and he's presenting. Every time Garrison talks to him, he's going to Clint Bolton, and he's showing him, hey, this is what's going on, this is what's going on. When you go through all the Kerry Thornley files, that becomes pretty fucking obvious. So it becomes pretty fucking obvious that Clint Bolton was Kerry Thornley's handler. So let me fucking make a mental note of that, so when I write this chapter, I know to insert that pretty early on. And I haven't done any research on Clint Bolton outside of these documents, and so I'm going to have to just breeze over this shit and then update it in the second edition, because I just don't have the time to fucking spend a month or two on Clint Bolton. Let me see. He even provided me with a woman. This was Jeannie Hack. Clint always called me his son, and one night when I was sitting in the Bourbon House, here's another thing, if he's old enough to call him his son, all of these men that Kerry Thornley is surrounding himself with are twice his age at least, if not more. Because Kerry Thornley's 22, 23 at this time. David Ferry's motherfucking 47, 48. Guy Bannister's in his 60s. So you got this young fucking guy. And all these dudes are fucking doing the weird gay orgy shit, right? Playing at the gay disco. So what's up with Kerry Thornley? Is he playing at the gay disco also? I think he is. We'll get to that. That ties into Marcella's pornography and shit. Which I'm not going to talk about today. But, so a while later, when I left Bourbon House, Jeannie, somewhat to my surprise, left with me and trailed around with me for the next several days. So his handler brought him a woman, and the woman trailed around with him. So that's the vibe I'm getting here. Jeannie's father, a Dr. Hack, was a well-known heart specialist at the Tulane Medical Center. See the specific. He keeps giving more specifics. He's giving Garrison so much information, drown him in it. And all of it's going to go nowhere. I'm sure Garrison figured that out. And Garrison did figure it out. And that's why the first fucking page of this file has this. Boom. Office, J.D. Tippett, Volume 7 of Texas Report. This is on page 2 of Garrison's Kerry Thornley file. Because he knew Kerry Thornley shot Tippett, and he knew Kerry Thornley was in Dallas. He knew Kerry Thornley was completely full of shit. So let's get back to page 20 of 159. There's that. As I was to learn, after the assassination, Oswald had made headlines that summer in New Orleans with his Fair Play for Cuba activities. Yet no one mentioned this to me when I got back to New Orleans in September. And this was one of the things that Jim Garrison could not believe in 1968. Yeah, this I'm going to need. Screenshot that bitch. I'll just take the whole page. As I was to learn after the assassination, Oswald had made headlines that summer in New Orleans after his Fair Play for Cuba Committee activities. Well, he didn't make headlines until August. And here he's talking about September, the following month, and also at a time when Oswald had already left. See, he's trying to explain that he and Oswald were never in the same place at the same time. It's complete bullshit. I had talked a lot about, let me see, this was one of the things that Jim Garrison could not believe in 1968, and it is peculiar. I had talked a lot about Oswald in 61 and 62, and had conversed about him extensively with Clint as a result of that spring, but neither Clint nor anyone else had said to me, hey, the guy you wrote about, the Idle Warriors, was in town last month. Alarm bells should be like fucking going off at this point. This had caused me to think very hard about who I was with in the autumn of 63 and what they seemed to be thinking about and doing. But before going into detail about that same time period in general, I want to cover my relationship with Slim. Holy fuck. Are we actually reading this guy's novel? This thing is fucking forever. What are we at? We're at 2 hours. All right, I'm going to take 5 minutes, get something to drink, and I shall be right back. Hang in there. Don't go anywhere. And if you have not already, there's a link down below. Go ahead and follow my gaming channel. Help me get affiliate on both of these channels. That would be much appreciated. And I'll be back in 5 minutes. Thanks, guys. After about 6 weeks, I began to pick up on things in Slim, which turned me off. Sometimes he would wear the same clothes without washing them for several days in a row until he smelled obnoxious. Also, after that first 6 weeks, he began telling the same old jokes and stories over again. Moreover, meanwhile, Greg and I had developed a number of new friends, so that eventually Slim became a minor friend instead of the major one he had been at the beginning. Slim did remain a colorful figure in our eyes. However, it was entirely pleasant to spend. It was entirely pleasant to spend an evening or afternoon with him now and then. Lai was not a writer, but he. What the fuck? Something is redacted there, and I can't tell what it is. Something. He was not a writer, but he had a way with words that was extraordinary. When he spoke, he dropped articles generally and resorted to original, albeit sometimes oft-repeated, ways of describing things. I remember, for example, the night he said of a couple we visited, of which the male member was scratched up and the female member bruised. Looks like they've been having an argument. By hand, I dubbed Slim a natural poet and called his one-liners Slimericks. I don't know what he's talking about here. When Slim and I first met, he was living on one of the streets in the quarter that runs parallel with Bourbon and with Rampart, and is located between them. Probably it was Dauphine. He lived there for quite a while. Later on, I'm not sure when, he was living out of the quarter on the Irish Channel on Magazine Street. He also lived here for quite some time. By 1964, he was living in the quarter again, somewhere up around Decatur Street. And the last few times I've seen him in a brief visit to the quarter in 1966, I believe, and in 1968 when I became involved with Jim Garrison's theories, Slim was living on Decatur Street. Okay, so it was 68 that Kerry Thornley is putting himself in the mix with Jim Garrison. Garrison started his investigation in like late 66, mid to late 66. So for Kerry Thornley not to have been in the mix till 68, ooh, I don't know if I buy that. That's a long fucking time to not know about Kerry Thornley. Kerry Thornley's name should have popped up early with all the Marine shit. Kerry Thornley should have been on Jim Garrison's fucking radar as soon as he realized that they both went from del Toro to Atsugi. Boom. That would have been fucking red flag city for Garrison. Garrison would have seen that and like he would have just known something was up there. I don't recall ever spending time with Gary without Slim being present, but most of the time I spent with Slim was without Gary, though Slim frequently brought Gary up, usually referring to him as brother-in-law. Slim seemed to find Gary quite fascinating, admiring in particular the deviousness of his mind. Also, during part of the time that I knew Slim, he was in a hospital which was out in the direction of Napoleon Avenue somewhere. I think I rode the Magazine Street bus to get there. This was sometime in the early 60s, before 1963. Because of his TB, Slim was not fit for the work he loved best, going to sea. So when you're talking about going to sea, you're talking about being a seaman, right? And so how many seamen are involved in the assassination? Well, I found about 6 or 7, but how many relevant seamen are involved? Well, you've got obviously Gary, or Slim, right, was a seaman, had gone to sea, and that was his love, right, or something along those lines. Then you have Raoul. Raoul was in the Navy, right? Then he went to Naval Intelligence. So he was a seaman also. And then you have Andrew Blackman, who was David Ferry's guy in New Orleans, who was the smuggler bringing in the heroin on the boat that was going to meet up with Rose Chermy and that whole fucking story. We're not going to talk about that today. But those are these seamen keep popping up, and the reason I think they were significant is because the connections there are obviously these guys who end up working for merchant marine or private seaman companies were all Navy at one time, including William Seymour, who went on to become merchant marine, I think, in 66. And so what you have is all these people who in the story had been seamen at one point or another, obviously connected to naval intelligence. Everyone keeps talking about CIA, but like I have a feeling naval intelligence plays a much more significant role than anyone realizes. God, I need another lifetime to study all this shit. All right, where the fuck was I? I don't recall. I'm going to reread this. I don't recall ever spending time with Gary without Slim being present, but most of the time I spent with Slim was without Gary, though Slim frequently brought Gary up, usually referring to him simply as brother-in-law. So Slim is referring to Gary as brother-in-law, but is that his actual brother-in-law? No. I believe that brother-in-law is actually a fucking code name or a fucking designation or some kind of pseudonym. And I think it's very strange that we have a brother-in-law who fucking was named Jack Valenti, who was born in 1936 and died in 2007. The weird thing is, you know who else died in 2007? The other fucking Jack Valenti. Like, one's dead, we gotta whack the other one now. I don't know. I have no evidence, no proof, no real reason to believe this, but the hairs on the back of my fucking neck stand up when I see this shit. Doesn't fucking make sense. So, yes, I think you're right. Garrison knew way more than he could prove. Yeah. So I wonder, would there be a connection from Jack Valenti to naval intelligence? Because, nah, he was Air Force. I don't understand how structure works in that shit. I'll be on Jack Valenti next month, and we'll be doing this for Jack Valenti too. So, Jack Valenti stuff I know pretty well. There's a ton there. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. We'll spend a couple days next month on Jack Valenti. And that will be the last chapter, ladies and gentlemen. The Jack Valenti chapter will be the final chapter after Kerry Thornley. I hope I can do all my fucking editing, finalization, cleanup in about 2 weeks after that. So put us like 6 weeks from right now. Figure, what's 2 months from today? 5th May. Man, if I could have the book out July 15th, I'd be fucking awesome. Awesome. So if that's what I'm hoping to do, odds are it'll be August 1st. That's realistic. So I'm getting tired. I'm going to wrap this up here in the next 20, 30 minutes or so. But for now, let me continue. Slim seemed to find Gary quite fascinating, admiring in particular his deviousness of his mind. Also, during part of the time that I knew Slim, he was in a hospital, which was out in the direction of Napoleon Avenue somewhere. I think I rode the Magazine Street bus to get there. This was sometime in the early 60s, before 63. Because of his TB, Slim was not fit for his work. He loved best going to sea, so he worked odd jobs and seemed to have a very hard time of it occasionally. Although, quote, brother-in-law was modestly well off, it appeared Slim never seemed to depend on him for help or to expect economic assistance. They both seemed philosophically opposed to that kind of relationship. Gary believed in survival of the fit, and Slim summed up his own ethic in that area as, I got mine, how you doing? For another brief period, I think in the autumn of 62, Slim was living, working, and singing hymns at some sort of Skid Row mission of his experience. He said, Lincoln freed the black ones 90 years ago. And here we go. In the same letter, he puts in a correction. Correction, he was living on Esplanade next to the Quorum in 64. 65 and 66. But he was not yet living on Decatur until 68. But see, none of that's relevant because they were talking about where he was living at 62. Right? You see what? Oh, this is mind games top to bottom in this letter. I can't believe he wrote this. Once again, your statement to cops should be, I know nothing. I didn't do it. Fuck off. At this time, I recall vividly only two things about Slim that revolve around the point in time when President Kennedy was killed. One night in the Bourbon House. So here we have Kerry Thornley again referring to Bourbon House because he was at the Bourbon House all the fucking time. And we have witnesses, which we'll get to, probably not today, but another time, probably tomorrow, of multiple sightings of Lee Harvey Oswald at the Bourbon House. Hello. 2 + 2 = 4. All the sightings of Lee Harvey Oswald at Bourbon House were Kerry Thornley. That's simple. And when you go through all 100+ incidents of Lee Harvey Oswald, you'll find none of them were fucking Lee Harvey Oswald. 0. So, where are we? So, one night in the Bourbon House, either shortly before or shortly after the assassination, Slim said in a mean growl, obviously for my benefit, though addressing someone else nearby, Kerry says I repeat myself like a worn-out record and so forth. Well, he'll learn. Then, for some reason, this paragraph was marked or highlighted by Garrison's people. Therefore, it's got something important in it. The other thing is that in December of 63, when I was contemplating forsaking my whim worshipping French Quarter friends, most of whom had shed tears over the death of JFK while I had seen the event as an occasion for celebration, I considered two different plans. One of those was to go directly to New York in order to be with more rational people, i.e. Ayn Rand and her followers. The other was to take up the invitation which a childhood friend of mine, Robert McDonald, had extended to recently live with him in Alexandria, Virginia, home of the CIA, then to settle there for a while by finding a job and my own place to live, then in perhaps a year to move on to New York. One afternoon, I discussed those alternatives with Slim in the Bourbon House, and he persuaded me to move to Alexandria. on the basis that it was near Washington, D.C., and my living there could increase the likelihood that I would be called to testify about Oswald, which in turn would be good publicity for my book and might help sell it to a publisher. Oh, fucking K. He just admitted here that he moved to fucking Alexandria because it would be close to Washington so he could testify about Oswald. If they happen to need him, which they did, I think. I forget. He talks to them and then doesn't talk to them, and then he meets with them, but then they say they didn't meet with him, so who the fuck knows? This is CIA nonsense. God, I wish the CIA would just fucking die already. As I've previously indicated, in early May of '63, I went to California to spend the summer with my parents. I believe they had sent me the money for bus fare as a birthday gift. For many years, I had wanted to visit Mexico City, and therefore, leaving New Orleans, I told Slim and many others that as I returned that fall, I was going to detour down to Mexico City and spend about a month. All right, so here we have again him admitting he went to Mexico City, and he was there about a month, and he went in September. He didn't get back in September. He got back at the earliest November 5th. Or October 5th, I'm sorry. October 5th. So, I kept in touch by letter with both Slim and Clint Bolton during my summer in Whittier, California. During this... I'm laughing because there's some shit coming up. I'm not sure if we're going to get to it today. I'm kind of getting burned out. But there's some shit coming up where he gets a job and who he gets a job, who lives in the building or he gets a job. It's fucking hilarious. Remember, in history, there's no such thing as coincidence. During the spring of 1963, I worked in a restaurant directly across from Disneyland part of the time and lived in a hotel in Anaheim. After that, I worked for a while at XX Mitchell's restaurant in East Whittier. Finally, toward the end of the summer, I wound up working at the Trappers Inn in La Habra. One day, probably in late August, I was dismissed from the job as a waiter at the Trappers Inn quite suddenly on the grounds that I was too slow. The man whose job it was to give me the news said he did not understand why Mr. Bullard, the owner, was firing me because he said there were other waiters working there who were slower than I was. This is like all nonsense just to fill space. Mr. Bullard and Mr. Mitchell, my previous employee, were friends, and I had been trying to act like a Mickey Spillane hero when I was working at XX Mitchell's and had made somewhat of a pain in the neck of myself. So it is possible that Mitchell told Bullard I was a bad egg or something, and that is why I was fired. It is also possible that Bullard, a Texan, was somehow indirectly influenced to fire me by Gary Kirstein or one of the other conspirators in order to get me moving in the direction of Mexico City at the time. Just think through that for a second. Uh-oh. Garrison loved this page. I have a feeling we will too. What does that say? Cares cures something gratuity here. Curses gratuity here. We'll see. I rode with my parents down to the Mexican border in late August and bought a bus ticket in Tijuana for Mexico City. Okay, so I rode with my parents down to the Mexican border in late August and bought a bus ticket in Tijuana for Mexico City. Late August. When did Lee Oswald allegedly go to the Mexican embassy in New Orleans to obtain the visa to go to Mexico City? I don't fucking remember offhand. But I'm going to have to fucking screenshot this because I'm going to have to compare the dates of when that incident occurred, which it's in my fucking book. I already wrote it. I should know. But my brain is like, it was a sponge and then it was full and now it's slowly like dripping out and soon will be empty. So yes, that's what's going on. And so I need to compare the dates of when fucking he allegedly went to the embassy in New Orleans. Compare that to what he says here about late August. I think that shit was in September. Let me see. If he was allegedly crossing the border on September 26th, then it had to have been September. Was it as far back as August? Ooh, it might have been. Might have been. I don't feel like Googling it, so it's going to have to wait, but I will have an answer for you by tomorrow. During the week, I wound up spending in Mexico City. So he says he only spent a week. He lives at the Hotel Marlin. That is not the hotel Oswald allegedly stayed at. He stayed at the L something something. Don't know, because Oswald never really fucking went there. Hotel Marlin had no contact whatsoever with anyone who spoke English. I had taken Spanish all during high school and during my 1 year of college, and had worked with Latin American waiters and busboys at the Sheraton Charles, many of which incidentally were anti-Castro Cubans. My Spanish was therefore good enough so I could get by. Okay, it's good enough to get by, but however, we already saw earlier in this fucking file that it was marked by Garrison he spoke fluent fucking Spanish. Now, how did Garrison know he spoke fluent Spanish? It didn't fucking matter. Because Garrison knew he spoke fluent Spanish, obviously, because he spoke to someone who knew him, who told them that he spoke fluent Spanish. Obviously. He was a fucking DA. That's what they do. That, to me, like, again, comes back to the fact that it was Kerry Thornley staying in the boarding houses, not fucking Oswald, because Mary Bledsoe, that dumb fucking bitch, let it slip that he got a call from a woman who spoke Spanish. Duh. Who could the woman be? Candy Barr, the only woman who has a fucking Spanish heritage in all goddamn assassination story. And she worked for Jack Ruby, and that was the connection between Kerry Thornley and Jack Ruby, who knew each other, because Oswald did not know fucking Jack Ruby. I don't give a fuck what any hack Kennedy researcher will tell you. During the week I wound up spending in Mexico City. I lived in the Hotel Marlin and had no contacts whatever with anyone who spoke English. I had taken Spanish all during high school and during my 1 year of college, and had worked with Latin American waiters and busboys at the Sheraton Charles, many of which, incidentally, were anti-Castro Cubans. My Spanish was therefore good enough so I could get by. Yes, important enough to read twice. Mexico City was a great disappointment to me. Not only was it much less exotic than Manila, which I expected it to resemble, but it was also much more expensive than I had anticipated. That is why I wound up leaving at the end of a week instead of going through with my plan to spend a month there. So he got there, and he got the ticket in late August, and he allegedly only spent a week there. See, if he had gotten there in late August and he did spend the month there, he would be leaving around that time. And we know that Oswald's fucking visa is stamped. So Oswald's alleged to have crossed the border back and gotten into fucking to meet with Laura Cottrell at the Texas Employment Commission by October 4th. However, I already said on that same day, we have the incident in Alice, Texas, where I'm telling you it was Kerry Thornley, not Oswald, who was seen at the radio station applying for a job, driving a car with the woman and the child. So, however, despite that being October 4th, Oswald's visa, and this is in the book also, I just can't remember offhand because my brain is mush, it was sometime around the 27th or 28th of September that his visa is actually stamped. Then you have like a conflict with the date the ticket was purchased. Yeah, the whole fucking thing is fucked up. They did this all wrong, because obviously the real tickets that Kerry Thornley used and the real hotel and the real shit that he used to get down there is not the props that they present to us, like the bus ticket and the fucking visa and all the fake shit that they had to manufacture to make it look like Oswald went there, right? So who the fuck knows? But yes, putting all this shit in chronological order and going back and comparing these statements is like key. That's like, I swear to God, it's a huge chunk of like the research is just putting shit down on paper in order and being like, does this make sense? And what did this fucking person say about it? And what did this fucking person say about it? And then you can draw this whole fucking like, you know, the thing from The Office with all the string and shit. That's where all that shit comes in. So, continuing on. Okay. Shortly after I returned to New Orleans, during, I think, the first week of September, Lee Harvey Oswald, probably acting on the instructions of FBI agent Hosty, went to Mexico City. I did not learn that Oswald had been to Mexico City until after the assassination, and when I did find out that not only had he been there, but had visited there, had occurred a couple of weeks after mine, I began to realize that others might have good reason for suspecting me of being part of the assassination conspiracy. Holy fucking shit. You think so? Do you think so? I think so. So he's getting paranoid because he thinks that his being there a couple weeks before would implicate him in the conspiracy. How about he was part of the fucking conspiracy and he has to backtrack this story because he was part of the conspiracy? I think that's much more plausible. If the plans for Oswald to go to Mexico City could for some reason not have been changed at the last minute, I think it is possible that the assassins planned somehow to get us involved with each other in Mexico City, and that my early return to New Orleans might have foiled that expectation. Perhaps not. In any case, Slim and therefore Gary was undoubtedly one of the first people to hear about it when I got back to the French Quarter in early September. My closest friend during September, October, November of 1963 was Clint Bolton. Oh my God. The more we go through this, the more I'm getting the feeling that Thornley is screaming to confess. He wants to confess. He wants to say everything. But he can't. He can't. He's telling them as much of the story as he can, but he's leaving himself as I'm the innocent guy. I don't know. All this was going on around me. I fucking don't know nothing. But I'm sensing that he is screaming to be heard that he did it. I don't know. What the fuck do I know? My closest friend during September, October, November of 63 was Clint Bolton, who I'm declaring was his CIA handler. Earlier, I sketched out some of Clint's interactions with me during that period, but did not include my recent speculations as to what Clint was doing in relation to a possible assassination conspiracy. Again, Clint was his friend all this time, and he's starting to think about speculating if Clint was involved in the assassination conspiracy, and here we have the conspiracy is happening all around Kerry Thornley, but not involving him. In 1968, when I came under Jim Garrison's suspicion, members of his staff, namely Andrew Scambria, told me that Clint Bolton had worked writing publicity for various CIA anti-Castro groups. It got back to me secondhand that Garrison regarded Clint as my CIA babysitter. You don't say. That's a fucking head scratcher. Why do you think that? The notion that a Princeton gentleman like Clint Bolton... So, Princeton gentleman. Okay, a Princeton gentleman, right? Like, well-to-do. I like to call them sweater vest kind of guys. The notion that a Princeton gentleman like Clint Bolton would have taken part in a murder plot against someone like John F. Kennedy has always struck me as absurd in the extreme. Really? Like fucking Clay Shaw? An acknowledged flamboyant in private, but very butch in public, homosexual. He was most certainly a sweater vest fucking guy. So yeah, it's funny his faux shock over this. The notion that a Princeton gentleman like Clint Bolton would have taken part in a murder plot against someone like John F. Kennedy has always struck me as absurd in the extreme. However, it is entirely possible that Clint would have taken part in such a conspiracy unwittingly, under the illusion that it was an official U.S. operation to assassinate Castro. Clint was friends with both Clay Shaw and with Guy Bannister. Hang on a second. Let's stop right there. So, we have Kerry Thornley openly putting himself in the company of David Ferry, Guy Bannister, pre-assassination, 61, right? What was it, September, summer, spring, whatever. It was 61, 62, around that time. Way before he was supposed to have known them, and also way before the assassination itself. And then here, he's telling us that he meets this older gentleman named Clint Bolton, who is a sweater vest fuck from Princeton, right? And he happens to be friends with Clay Shaw and Guy Bannister, right? This is so. I'm speechless. Do I have to say anything? Can you guys anticipate what I want to say? You have this young fucking guy in his early 20s, looks like fucking Oswald, being mistaken for him all over the place, and he just happens to be surrounded by these three fucking guys who happen to be all CIA, who just happen to love the book that he happens to be writing about a fucking guy who is possibly CIA, who defected to the Soviet Union, who then comes back and eventually will kill the president, but he wrote the book 2 years before he does. Are you fucking kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me? You can't make this fucking shit up. You can't. You cannot make this shit up. This is ungoddamn believable. If most of the fucking world knew about this aspect of the Kennedy assassination, their fucking heads would explode, like mine is fucking doing right now. Fuck. No evidence that anybody but Oswald had anything to do with the assassination, right? Fucking Michael Shermer, you fucking scumbag. Unfucking real. Okay, so Clint was friends both with Clay Shaw and Guy Bannister. Strikes me as extremely possible that Bannister might have told him Oswald was going to assassinate Castro and have assigned him to coach me in rewriting the Idle Warriors in order to provide cover that would emphasize Oswald's loner qualities and thereby help disassociate him from the Central Intelligence Agency and or Federal Bureau of Investigation. So now we have Kerry Thornley caught up in a fucking web of espionage, assassination, and intrigue, and his fucking novel about Oswald is at the center of it. The fucking delusions of grandeur. Unbelievable. My most recent address for Clint is 1231 Decatur Street. New Orleans, Louisiana, 70116, phone number, blah, blah, blah. It seems to me that it should be fairly high priority to question Clint. Really? Interesting. Yeah, I don't understand what Kerry Thornley thinks he's doing here. I think he thinks he's smarter than everybody. It seems to me that it should be fairly high priority to question Clint, approached by official investigators who ask sufficiently pointed questions. I'm relatively certain Clint would have a great deal to say that would shed light on the JFK assassination. Please keep in mind that Clint has a bad heart and is important to avoid coming on tough with him, etc. As recently as 1968, Clint maintained his belief that the lone assassin theory, I think, was a sincere stance. Clint probably knew that Oswald was a government agent and thought that he was slated to kill Castro and had somehow flipped out and killed Kennedy instead. I have a number of miscellaneous memories concerning my interactions with Clint in the fall of '63. Garrison noted here, third time Kerry Thornley says this. Clint probably knew Oswald was a government agent and thought he was slated to kill Castro and somehow flipped and killed Kennedy instead. And he told that to Garrison at least 3 times, right? So let me fucking highlight that. That's going to be important. I have a number of miscellaneous memories concerning my interactions with Clint in the fall of '63. So here's my problem. So let me give you my take on Clint. Clint doesn't exist. He can't exist. When it comes to David Ferrie, picture David Ferrie being at the center of a wheel. And then going out from David Ferrie, you have the actual shooters in the assassination, right? Sergio Cacha, Emilio Santana, Lawrence Howard, Lauren Hall, William Seymour. Ultimately, David Ferrie will be the connection to Cleveland. I mean, he's also connected to the New Jersey guys, like Robert Bernard Baker, via Frank Sheeran, right? The other Irishman, besides Danny Green. And so David Ferrie is the connection everywhere. But remember, like the mob guys, they all sent their own teams. Like Marcello sent David Ferrie and his crew, right? And then you have Traficante sent Valente, the null shooter. And then you have Giancana out of Chicago sending Robert Bernard Baker, Dave Yaris, Lenny Patrick, and the Cleveland guys. Danny Green, Leo Masseri. And those guys were under Licavoli, under the Cleveland mob, which was really Chicago. That was still Chicago outfit. That was just an extension of the Chicago outfit, right? So that's how it all went down, basically. And so, let me think. I'm tired. I think that's going to do it for today. I'm kind of falling out, so I'm going to leave this right here, and I will pick up right here with this tomorrow, probably about the same time. So please, if you haven't yet, please follow me here. I got to reach that magic number of 75 followers as soon as possible. And follow my gaming channel, and I will be back here tomorrow. And if you haven't yet, buy my book, pre-order the book. You get my notes and all that shit. It's the links down below, and I will see you tomorrow.